Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. I never thought working the night shift at a gas station could be so unsettling. It was a small, isolated station just off the highway, located on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where people stop only when they need gas or a quick snack. But it was quiet, too quiet, especially after midnight. The first few weeks were uneventful, just the usual routine. I'd stock the shelves, clean the pumps, and wait for the rare customer to roll in. Most of the time I was alone, save for the occasional trucker or late-night commuter. But after a while things started to change. Small, unexplainable things began to happen. It started with the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a stray animal wandering around outside. But the footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate, slow, almost as if someone was pacing around the station. They would start outside the door and slowly move around the side of the building, then fade away. One night it happened again. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps. It was just past 2 a.m. and there was no one in sight. I stood up, thinking maybe someone had walked up to the door without me noticing. But when I peered through the window there was nothing. No car, no person, just the empty parking lot. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the footsteps came again a few minutes later, and this time, I heard them moving toward the door. I froze, staring at the glass. The handle rattled, and then there was a knock. Sharp, quick, like someone was tapping on the door with their knuckles. I felt a chill run through me, my heart pounding. I slowly walked to the door and looked out. There was no one there. My breath fogged up the glass as I pressed my palm against it, trying to steady myself. I was about to turn away when I noticed something strange, footprints in the dust near the door. They were fresh, the kind that you would see if someone had just walked by. But the thing is, there had been no one outside when I checked just moments before. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and dialed the number for the nearest police station. I explained what had been happening. The footsteps, the knocking, the footprints that appeared out of nowhere. The officer on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as if he'd heard this story 100 times before. Just stay inside the station. We'll send someone by to check it out, he said. I hung up, trying to stay calm, but something in my gut told me that this wasn't just some prank. I felt like I was being watched. As the minutes ticked by, the feeling intensified. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just outside the station, waiting. Then, at around 3 a.m., the power went out. The lights flickered, then went completely dark. I stumbled over to the flashlight I kept behind the counter and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but it only made the shadows seem deeper, more suffocating. I walked over to the front door, shining the flashlight through the window. There was something out there, something moving. I squinted, my breath fogging up the glass, but I couldn't make it out. The flashlight flickered, and then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the lights came back on. I turned around and froze. The back of the store was now lit up by the light from the gas pumps, and standing right in the middle of the room facing me was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, and I could feel my pulse racing in my throat. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone again. But before I could call the police, the man turned and walked out the door. I didn't even hear him leave. I rushed to the window, but he was gone. The parking lot was empty again. The only thing left was the faint smell of something like burnt rubber, and the unmistakable sound of my own breathing, loud and frantic in the silence. When the police arrived, they found no sign of anyone. The surveillance footage didn't show anything out of the ordinary. No one had entered the building. No strange man had been lurking around. There were no new footprints, and there was no evidence of any disturbance. I felt insane trying to explain what I had experienced, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened. I worked the rest of my shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps returned, more persistent this time, tapping around the building, always just out of sight. The knocking came again, but no one was there. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating, with the same eerie sense of something watching me. I didn't stay long at that gas station after that night. I couldn't. I put in my notice a few days later, and when I walked out for the last time, I turned around to look at the building. The lights were on, but the place felt empty, abandoned, like something had been taken away. Something that I couldn't quite understand. I never figured out who or what was behind those footsteps. But I know one thing, there's something in the dark out there waiting for its next victim. I had always been the adventurous type, the kind who loved exploring places off the beaten path. So, when my friend Tim suggested we go camping in the woods a few miles outside of town, I was all in. The plan was simple. Set up camp, enjoy the outdoors, and maybe get a few good pictures of the sunset. We had no idea that our weekend trip would turn into something much darker. It started innocently enough. We parked our car at the edge of a dirt road that led into the forest, unloaded our gear, and began walking toward the campsite. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the forest was quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Tim and I were talking, joking about past camping trips and our plans for the weekend, when we stumbled upon something unusual. As we walked deeper into the woods, we came across an old dirt path that led to a rundown farm. The barn was dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but what caught my attention was the large farmhouse at the end of the property. It was eerie, like something out of a forgotten time. The paint was peeling and the front porch creaked under the weight of time, yet there was something strangely captivating about it. Tim's excitement was contagious. He grinned at me, his eyes sparkling as he looked at the house. "Should we check it out?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure. The house looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. Still, my curiosity got the better of me and I agreed. We decided to take a quick look around before heading to the campsite. We crossed the overgrown yard, stepping over patches of weeds and cracked stones. As we got closer to the front door, I noticed something odd. The door wasn't completely closed. It was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had recently walked in or out. "Let's just peek inside," Tim urged, already pushing the door open before I could protest. It creaked loudly, sending a shiver up my spine. The inside was dark and musty. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled stale, like no one had breathed in here for a long time. But there was something else too, a faint, odd smell. It was hard to place, like something burning, but I couldn't tell if it was recent or just an old odor clinging to the house. We walked further in, the floorboards creaking under our feet. Tim pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. I watched as he scanned the room, his light bouncing off the rotting furniture scattered around. A couch lay tipped over in one corner, its fabric torn and shredded. A few old newspapers littered the floor, yellowed with age. "Looks like this place has been empty for years," I muttered, uneasy. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A picture frame on the mantelpiece. It was a family photo, black and white, from what must have been the 1940s. A man, woman, and two children stood together, smiling for the camera. But the thing that stood out to me was the way their eyes seemed to follow me. They were unervingly lifelike, and it was almost as if they were watching my every move. I took a step back, a chill running down my spine. I didn't want to stay any longer, but Tim was already moving deeper into the house, heading toward the staircase. "Come on, let's see upstairs," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. I hesitated, but he was already halfway up. Reluctantly, I followed him up the creaky stairs. The hallway at the top was just as eerie, with doors leading into rooms that had been left untouched for years. But one door at the end of the hall was different. It wasn't quite shut. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. "Let's check that one out," Tim said, his voice low. but before I could stop him, he was already opening the door. Inside was a bedroom, but it looked like it had been frozen in time. A bed covered in a faded floral quilt sat in the center of the room, and a dresser with cracked mirrors lined one wall. But what really disturbed me was the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, slowly rocking back and forth. I thought it was just the wind, but there was no breeze. It was as if the chair was rocking on its own. My heart began to race. I took a step back, my breath quickening. "Tim, we need to go." "Now," I said, panic rising in my chest. My voice was shaky, but I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Tim didn't listen. He was already rummaging through the drawers of the dresser, looking for something. My mind raced, but all I could think about was how much I wanted to leave. It felt like the house was pressing in on me. I could hear the whispering, a low, guttural voice coming from somewhere behind the walls. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. The sound seemed to surround us, crawling under my skin. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. Tim froze. "Yeah." "What is that?" he asked, looking around the room nervously. The whispering intensified, echoing through the walls, until it was a clear voice, though I couldn't make out the words. I grabbed Tim's arm, feeling an icy grip of fear tighten in my chest. "Let's get out of here now," I said, pulling him toward the stairs. We rushed back down, but as we reached the front door, I glanced back one last time. The door, which had been slightly ajar when we entered, was now wide open, swinging in the wind. It felt like an invitation to something unseen, something waiting. We ran back to our campsite, not daring to look back. Every step I took felt heavier, like something was following us, lurking just behind. My mind raced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the entire time. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the woods without saying much. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, but the events replayed in my mind over and over. There was the photo on the mantelpiece, the family with eyes that seemed too real, and the rocking chair. I couldn't forget the way it moved on its own, how the whispering had seemed to reach right inside me. As we drove back to town, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering. It's as if the abandoned farm is calling me back, waiting for me to return. I had been working the night shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of town for a few months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and I didn't mind the quiet nights. The station was tucked away from the main road, surrounded by empty fields and a dense forest. It was the kind of place you wouldn't want to be stuck at alone, but it was all I could get at the time. I remember that particular night so clearly. It was cold, and the wind howled outside, making the trees creak and groan. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was broken by the occasional sound of a car pulling in, but otherwise, the place was eerily quiet. The only company I had was the radio playing low music and the faint buzzing of the vending machine in the corner. It was a slow night, just like any other, until the storm rolled in. It started with a light drizzle, then quickly turned into a downpour, with thunder rumbling in the distance. The rain was so heavy I could barely see past the gas pumps. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight. Normally, I'd start to feel the exhaustion set in at this hour, but something about that night was different. Around 1:30 a.m., I noticed the headlights of a car pulling into the station. It was an older sedan, its headlights cutting through the rain like a beacon. The car rolled up slowly, and I couldn't make out much of the driver through the windshield. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a traveler needing gas. But when the car stopped, the engine cut out, and the driver didn't get out right away, I felt an odd tension in the air. I stared at the car for a few moments, waiting for the driver to emerge. But nothing happened. The rain began to pound harder on the roof, making it hard to hear anything outside. The only thing I could see were the bright headlights, illuminating the front of the station in an almost surreal way. After a few minutes of waiting, I decided to go out and check. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the storm, the cold rain soaking through my clothes almost immediately. As I approached the car, I saw the driver's side door was slightly open, but the seat was empty. The car's interior light was on, but there was no sign of anyone around. My heart began to pound in my chest. I leaned in and looked around, thinking maybe they were just getting something from the trunk or maybe using the restroom in the back. But when I peeked inside, the front seat was empty, and the back seat was strangely clean, as if no one had ever sat there. I was about to close the door and head back inside when I heard something behind me, the distinct sound of footsteps in the rain-soaked gravel. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing just a few feet away, was a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and he was staring at me with an expression I couldn't place. His face was hidden under the hood of his jacket, but I could see the faint outline of his features. He wasn't holding anything, no bags, no umbrella. Just standing there in the rain, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. My voice came out shakier than I expected. He didn't answer. He just stood there watching me. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I tried to take a step back, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Something about the man felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. Finally, after what felt like forever, he moved. He took a slow step forward, then another, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body had frozen in place. The rain poured down harder, but the man didn't seem to care. He just kept walking toward me, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. Just as he was about to reach me, I snapped out of my trance. I turned and bolted toward the station door, slamming it behind me. My heart was racing as I fumbled for the lock, finally securing it. I could still hear the sound of footsteps outside, but when I peered through the small window, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I stood there for a few moments, breathing heavily, my mind racing. What had just happened? I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had seen the man, heard his footsteps, felt the chill in the air. But there was no way he could have disappeared that fast. I decided to call it a night. The rest of my shift felt like a blur, and I was on edge the whole time. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept expecting the man to show up again. But the rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't see him again, and the storm eventually died down. The next morning I was still shaken, but I figured maybe I had just let my imagination get the best of me. I went in to check the security cameras, hoping to find some evidence of the man's presence. Maybe something that would explain it. But when I rewound the footage from that time, I was horrified. The cameras had gone black at exactly the moment the man had approached me. There was no footage of him entering and no footage of him leaving. The cameras had simply malfunctioned. I never worked that night shift again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, and I couldn't explain what had happened. The man, the footsteps, the way he vanished. It all felt wrong. To this day, I still drive past that gas station sometimes, and I can't help but glance at the darkened windows, wondering if I'll ever truly know what happened that night. I've never been a superstitious person. I've always believed in logic and science, and I've never had much time for ghost stories or tales of things that go bump in the night. But that was before the night I encountered him. Before that night, I would have laughed off anything that couldn't be explained away by a rational explanation. But after what happened, I'm not so sure anymore. I had just moved into my new apartment in the city. It was a small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an old building in a quiet neighborhood. The building wasn't the nicest, but it was cheap, and I didn't need anything fancy. It had a certain charm, and the landlord was kind enough to offer me a good deal. I was living alone for the first time in my life, and while the thought of it excited me, it also made me a little nervous. Still, I was confident that it would be fine. It was just a place to sleep after all. The first few days went by without incident. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the sound of traffic outside. I spent my time unpacking and settling in, getting used to the space. There was an old antique mirror in the hallway that had caught my eye the moment I moved in. It had been left behind by the previous tenant, and though I wasn't a fan of old things, I figured it would be a good place to hang my coat. But then things started to feel off. It started small, barely noticeable at first. A chill in the air when I walked past the hallway mirror, a faint feeling of being watched when I'd sit on the couch, and sometimes, late at night, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. I brushed it off as the building settling, maybe other tenants coming and going, or the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the old building. But one night everything changed. It was around 11 p.m. I was curled up on the couch, reading a book, when I heard the footsteps again. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized something. The footsteps weren't just from outside my door. They were coming from the hallway just outside the living room. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was taking their time walking toward my apartment. I held my breath and listened. The sound of the footsteps came closer, then stopped right outside my door. I waited for the inevitable knock, but it never came. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I finally stood up, my legs shaky, and went to the door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear anything on the other side. But there was nothing. No breathing, no movement, no sound at all. I opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. The light above flickered for a second, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped out into the hallway, glancing around. There was no one there. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before I went back inside and locked the door behind me. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The footsteps would start again, but now they seemed closer. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to find that the hallway light was on, even though I had turned it off before going to bed. I would hear the creaking of the floors, the soft sound of someone walking through the apartment, though no one was there. The thing that disturbed me the most, though, was the mirror. Every time I passed it, I couldn't help but glance into it. It was always the same, a reflection of the hallway, a glimpse of my own face. But every now and then I would see something else. A shadow, barely noticeable, moving behind me. It would be gone in the blink of an eye, but I could never shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One evening, after hearing the footsteps again, I decided to confront whatever was going on. I grabbed my phone and began recording. I stood in the hallway just outside the living room and I called out, "Is anyone there?" I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know who you are, but I want you to stop." For a few moments there was nothing. Then, as I stood there trying to steady my breathing, I saw something in the mirror. This time it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure. A tall, dark shape standing in the hallway behind me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't stop shaking. I watched the video over and over, but all I could see was my reflection in the mirror. The figure wasn't visible in the footage. It was like it had never been there at all. I decided to contact the landlord the next day. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I needed answers. When I told him about the strange happenings, he was quiet for a long time. Finally he spoke. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low. "This building, it has a history. A lot of tenants have reported strange things happening here. Footsteps, voices, strange shadows. And it's always around that mirror." He paused before continuing. "The previous tenant left in a hurry. I didn't think much of it, but now that I hear you're having the same experiences..." I didn't need him to finish. I knew exactly what he meant. There was something in that apartment, something tied to the mirror, something that had been there long before I moved in. That night I packed my things. I didn't care how much I had already paid or how difficult it would be to find another place. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I left, I glanced at the mirror one last time. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the reflection, but when I looked closer, it was gone. I haven't gone back to that apartment since, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever was in that building, whatever was tied to that mirror, I don't think it will ever let go. It's still out there waiting, watching. It was a quiet neighborhood. Not the kind of place where anything exciting ever happens, just a simple suburban block where everyone knew each other by name. I had only moved in a few months prior, but it didn't take long for me to get acquainted with the neighbors. They were friendly enough, each one always offering a smile and a wave when we crossed paths. But then there was Henry. Henry lived a few houses down from me. He was in his early 60s, had a kind face with graying hair, and always wore a light jacket even when it wasn't that cold outside. I noticed him more than the others, maybe because he was a bit more reserved. He didn't socialize much, but when he did, he seemed pleasant enough. I would see him sitting on his porch, reading the newspaper or tending to his small garden. Everything seemed normal with Henry, until the night I heard something strange. It was a Thursday evening around 9:30 p.m. I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I heard loud banging noises coming from Henry's house. I figured maybe he was doing some late-night renovations or had dropped something heavy, but the noise didn't stop. It went on for several minutes, rhythmic, like someone was hammering repeatedly into the walls or floor. I got up and went to my window to look outside, thinking that maybe something had happened. I could see the faint glow of lights coming from Henry's house. His porch light was on, but there was no movement from the front yard. The curtains were drawn and the banging had stopped. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my phone and texted a neighbor, asking if they had heard the noises too. No response. I waited a few more minutes before deciding to walk over there myself. It wasn't far and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. When I reached his house, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar, which was strange because Henry always kept it locked. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. After waiting for a moment, I pushed the door open a little further, calling out, "Henry? Are you okay?" No response. I stepped inside, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The house was unnervingly quiet. I called his name again, but only silence greeted me. The living room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. It looked like Henry hadn't been home at all. That's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The furniture was rearranged. His couch, which was normally positioned against the wall, had been moved to the center of the room. The coffee table was overturned, and the chairs were pushed aside. It was as if someone had been frantically searching for something or hiding something. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart racing. The house didn't feel right. The air was thick and there was an unsettling sense of abandonment. I called his name again, louder this time, but still no response. I moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen was untouched, the bathroom was clean, and his bedroom door was closed. As I approached, I noticed that the door was unlocked. I gently pushed it open, feeling a sense of dread crawl over me. And then I saw it. The bed was neatly made, but there was something off about the room. The window was wide open, even though it was a chilly night. The curtains fluttered in the breeze. But it wasn't just the window that made me feel uneasy, it was the empty dresser drawers. Clothes were scattered all over the floor as if someone had quickly rifled through them. It looked like Henry had left in a hurry. I looked around the room one last time, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I heard a soft creaking sound from behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat. Standing in the doorway was Henry. He was looking at me, but his eyes seemed strange. There was no recognition in them, just a blank, hollow stare. He was wearing the same jacket I had seen him in countless times, but he looked different. His face was pale, and his expression was distant, as if he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. "Henry?" I asked, taking a hesitant step toward him. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back into the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate. I followed him, my feet moving against my will, as if drawn by an invisible force. He led me to the front door. I stopped just inside the threshold, my mind racing. There was something wrong with this whole situation. I glanced back at Henry, but when I looked again, he was gone. The door slammed shut behind me and I jumped, startled. I turned around quickly to see if Henry was still there, but the porch was empty. The lights flickered for a moment, then turned off completely. I stood frozen, my breath shallow and fast. I didn't know what was happening, but I was certain something wasn't right. I ran back to my house, locking the door behind me, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found no sign of Henry. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of anything unusual. Just an empty house, the furniture still in disarray. The strangest part? The neighbors swore they hadn't seen Henry in days. They hadn't heard the banging noises either. It was like he had disappeared. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I had seen. The empty drawers, the strange look in Henry's eyes, the way he led me out of his house like he was being controlled by something. I haven't heard from Henry since. I don't even know if he still lives there. But every so often, I swear I hear the same strange banging sounds coming from his house late at night. It's almost like he's still there, waiting for something. I don't know what happened to Henry, but whatever it wasn't natural. I've always worked the night shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of town. It's a quiet, mundane job, just me, the radio, and the occasional customer pulling in for fuel or snacks. Most of the time, it's nothing more than a routine. I'll check the pumps, stock the shelves, and occasionally grab a cup of coffee to pass the hours. I've always liked the solitude, the peace of the night. But that was before the last shift. It was a Friday night when everything changed. The shift was like any other. I'd been working there for a little over 6 months, and I'd seen everything. Late-night truckers, drunk college kids looking for cigarettes, the occasional cop filling up his patrol car. Nothing ever felt too out of the ordinary. But that night, around 3:30 a.m., a customer pulled up that I'll never forget. I was just finishing restocking the candy aisle when I heard the hum of a car engine outside. I glanced up, expecting another quiet vehicle, but instead, a beat-up old sedan slowly coasted to a stop at the pump closest to the store. The headlights were off, and the car's engine sputtered to a halt before it completely died. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon for people to run out of gas, especially out here. But as I stepped closer to the window, I noticed something strange. The driver's side window was rolled down, but the driver himself was slumped forward in the seat, motionless. I hesitated for a moment. Maybe he had just fallen asleep? It wouldn't have been the first time I'd seen someone take a quick nap in their car. But something about the stillness of the figure made me uneasy. I grabbed the intercom and pressed the button. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Do you need some help?" There was no answer. I repeated myself, but still nothing. I watched the car, waiting for any sign of movement. It felt like time was moving slower than usual. I stepped away from the counter and grabbed the keys to the store door, deciding to check on the man in person. As I made my way outside, I noticed the odd feeling of silence. The usual sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind were completely absent. It was unnaturally quiet, almost as if the whole world had paused. I walked up to the car, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. When I reached the driver's side window, I knocked on it. The man didn't stir. I leaned closer, peering inside. That's when I saw it. The driver's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. His face was pale, almost gray, and his skin had a sickly, waxy texture. I recoiled, feeling my stomach churn. There was something off about him. He looked like he'd been dead for hours, maybe even longer. I quickly backed away from the car, my heart racing. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone else coming to check on the situation, but the lot was empty. I stood frozen, my breath quickening. There was no one there. No other cars, no signs of life. Just the same eerie silence. I turned back to the car and glanced at the driver again. To my horror, his head had shifted slightly. Just enough for me to notice that he was now staring directly at me through the window. His pupils were gone, replaced by empty, black sockets. I stumbled backward, panic starting to rise in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Call the police? Get inside and lock the door? But as I was about to make a move, the car's headlights suddenly flickered on. The engine sputtered back to life. The car lurched forward, startling me. It started moving slowly toward the exit, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the dark road without a sound. I stood there, staring at the spot where the car had been, my mind spinning. What had just happened? Who was that man? And why did it feel like I had just witnessed something I wasn't meant to see? I stayed in the store the rest of the night, too scared to step back outside. I kept the door locked, the lights on, and the register closed. The rest of my shift passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every small noise in the store made my heart race. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, it all sounded amplified, like the world was pressing in on me. The next morning, I called the police, though I didn't expect them to believe me. I told them about the car, the man, and the strange way he had looked. They didn't seem interested at first, but they agreed to check the area. When they arrived, they searched the parking lot, the road outside, and even a small patch of woods behind the station. They found nothing. No car. No evidence. No signs of the man. I couldn't explain it. But then the strangest thing happened. A few weeks later, I was cleaning the back office when I found an old photo tucked behind a stack of papers. It was a picture of the gas station from years ago, taken in the late 80s. The building looked the same, but there was one thing that caught my attention. A man in the photo standing next to the pumps. He was wearing a faded jacket, just like the one the man in the car had worn. The face was too blurry to make out, but there was something familiar about it. I showed the picture to my coworker who'd been working here for years. She went pale when she saw it. That's the guy who died here," she said in a hushed voice. "They said he passed away in his car after a long night on the road. Never saw it coming." I felt a shiver run down my spine. That man in the picture, the one I had seen in the car, wasn't just a stranger. He was the same person who had died here years ago. And yet, that night he had come back. I haven't worked the night shift since then. I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I still see his lifeless eyes staring at me from that car. I don't know what happened that night or if it was even real. But I do know one thing, there's something about that gas station. Something that doesn't let people leave. I had just started my job as a long-distance truck driver, traveling through back roads and winding highways across the Midwest. It was a lonely existence, but that's the way I liked it. The hum of the engine, the open road, it was just me, the road, and the sky. One night, around 2 a.m., I was driving down a stretch of highway that I had passed countless times. The road was straight, flat, and surrounded by miles of empty fields. The kind of place where you could fall asleep at the wheel and not hit another car for hours. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world feels distant and almost weightless. As I passed a small, rundown truck stop, something caught my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the road. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was wearing a long coat, a hat pulled low over his face, and he was staring directly at me as I drove past. My headlights illuminated him for just a split second, but in that brief moment, something didn't feel right. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. It was as if he was waiting for me to see him. I shook my head and turned my focus back to the road. Maybe he was just some stranded traveler or someone waiting for a ride. But as I drove on, the strange feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, motionless. A few miles later, I pulled off the highway onto a small dirt road to take a break. I had learned early on that long stretches of highway can blur time, and sometimes you need to stop to reset your mind. I parked the rig, stepped out, and stretched my legs, trying to shake off the unease. But as I stood there, I heard something strange. The faint sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone approaching, but the night was still. No one was there. I shrugged it off as the wind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine. The moment I pulled out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The truck stop was now behind me, but in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. The man I had seen earlier was standing on the edge of the road again. But this time he was much closer to the truck, far too close for someone to have walked there so quickly. I watched in horror as he stood perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as if waiting for something. There was no car around, no other movement. Just the figure in the distance. It didn't make sense. I had passed him miles ago. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and sped off, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me. I kept checking my mirrors, but the road was empty. No one in sight. Still, I couldn't relax. It was like I could feel him even if I didn't see him. Hours passed, but the strange sensation didn't go away. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I half expected to see that figure again, but there was nothing. Just empty road stretching out endlessly in front of me. I thought about pulling over again, maybe calling someone for reassurance. But something kept me driving. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But then, as the sun began to rise and I neared my destination, I saw it again. In the distance, standing by the roadside, the figure was waiting. He was still in the same spot where I had first seen him. But this time, something had changed. The man was no longer looking at me. His head was turned away, his back to the road. And his coat, once dark, now appeared to be covered in what looked like dirt or something darker. My heart pounded as I drove past, my gaze fixed on him. I couldn't help it, I felt drawn to look. And just as I passed him, I saw something that made me gasp. The man had no face, no eyes, just smooth, featureless skin where his face should have been. I floored the accelerator, my truck roaring to life as I sped down the road, too terrified to look back. My mind raced with confusion and fear. I had never seen anything like that before. What was that thing? And why did it feel like it was following me? When I finally reached my destination, I parked the truck in a hurry and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't even bother unloading. I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. It's been weeks since that night, but I still can't shake the memory of that faceless figure. I've driven that stretch of road multiple times since, and each time I expect to see him again standing there waiting. But he's never there. Still, I know he's out there, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that one night he'll be in the truck with me, right next to me in the passenger seat where I'll never see him, but I'll know he's there, and I'll be unable to escape. I had just moved into the quiet suburbs, hoping for a fresh start. It wasn't my first time relocating, but this house felt different. Old, a little too quiet, but in a way that promised peace. The kind of place where you could leave the chaos behind, just breathe and forget about the noise of the world. The house was an antique, a two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a faded red door. I wasn't concerned by its age. It had character, and that was something I wanted. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my things, sorted through boxes, and explored the creaky rooms. The house had an atmosphere about it, but I didn't think much of it. The wood floors would groan with each step, and the windows would catch the wind at night, making faint sounds, nothing to be alarmed by. It was just a house settling, I thought. But then things began to shift, gradually at first. It started with the shadows. In the late afternoons, when the light slanted in through the windows, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. A fleeting figure, a shape too quick to identify. I convinced myself it was just the house playing tricks. Shadows from the trees swaying outside, the way the sun angled through the leaves. But after a while, even I couldn't ignore it. Every time I walked down the hall, I felt watched. I felt something move behind me, though when I turned, no one was there. I told myself I was tired. Maybe it was the stress of settling in, of change. But the unease grew. One evening, the sensation was stronger than usual. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard the sound, a soft creak like something shifting on the second floor. It wasn't like the usual groans of the house. This was deliberate. I paused in the kitchen, holding my breath. The sound came again, slower this time, like footsteps. I stood frozen for a long moment, my heart thudding. I was alone. I was sure of it. I grabbed the nearest flashlight, my pulse racing, and slowly made my way upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. The house was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional thump of my shoes on the floorboards. When I reached the landing, I felt a cold draft hit me in the face. The hallway was dark, and my flashlight beam barely cut through the blackness. I stood still, waiting for the next sound. Nothing. But as I turned to head toward the guest room, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. It was a door. The door at the end of the hall, the one I hadn't yet opened. It was slightly ajar. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before. I thought I had checked all the rooms. The door creaked open by itself, like it was inviting me in. My feet moved on their own, drawn toward it, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. When I pushed the door open, the room was completely empty. But the air felt off, thick, heavy, like the room was holding its breath. I looked around, trying to make sense of the space. The walls were bare, save for a few faded wallpaper remnants, and the floor was covered in dust, untouched for years. But something wasn't right. I noticed a strange pattern in the dust. It was as if someone had walked in a perfect circle, around and around, in the center of the room. The shape was too precise, too deliberate. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it again, the soft creak of floorboards coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, but the room was empty. No movement. No sound. I quickly backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut, and for a few moments I just stood there in the hallway, unable to move. I felt dizzy, as if the walls were closing in on me. But after a deep breath, I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay frozen forever. I left the house for a few days after that. I couldn't bear to be in there alone anymore. I thought it might help, stepping away, clearing my head. But when I returned, it was worse. I hadn't even reached the door before I felt it, the unmistakable pressure of someone standing behind me. I spun around, but the porch was empty. Still, the sensation didn't fade. It followed me inside, the air inside the house feeling thick and unwelcoming. My skin prickled with unease. I spent the next few days in a constant state of tension. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was there with me, something in the shadows. That same door was always slightly ajar, no matter how many times I shut it. It felt like the house was alive, breathing, waiting. And then one night, when I was sitting in the living room, I heard something I couldn't ignore. A whisper. It was barely audible at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew clearer, more insistent. It seemed to come from above me, from the attic. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and pulled down the attic ladder. My hands shook as I climbed into the dark space. The attic was as I expected, dusty, filled with forgotten things, and bathed in darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the room lit up, I froze. The floorboards were covered in the same circle pattern from the room below, and in the center of the circle was a small, old wooden box. I didn't want to touch it, but something told me I had no choice. I knelt down and opened the box. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, faces blurred and distorted, with no names to identify them. And one thing more, a single piece of paper scribbled in frantic handwriting. It read, "Leave before it's too late." I slammed the box shut, my chest tight with fear. I ran down the attic stairs, out of the house, and never returned. I don't know what that house was or who was still trapped inside it. But whatever it was, it had made its mark on me. I left and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the distance. Just soft enough to make me wonder, is it real or is it the house still calling me back? had always been curious about old houses. The creaking floors, the stories they held, the dust and cobwebs hiding secrets of past occupants. That's why I was so eager to rent the old Victorian house on the edge of town. It was a bargain, far too cheap for a house that large, but the landlord had assured me it was just because it had been sitting vacant for years. No one had lived there since the previous tenants left abruptly. I didn't ask why. The house was charming in its own way. Old wooden floors, a grand staircase, and huge windows that let in so much light it almost felt like the house was alive. But there was one room in particular that caught my attention: the basement. The door to the basement was tucked away behind the kitchen, almost as if it didn't belong to the house. It was small, unremarkable, and covered in layers of dust. The first time I opened it, the stairs seemed to disappear into darkness, as though the basement stretched on forever. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight and descended into the cool, musty air. The basement was large, far larger than I expected, with old wooden beams supporting the ceiling. Boxes of forgotten belongings were stacked haphazardly in the corners, and there were piles of old newspapers scattered across the floor. But there was something in the back corner that I hadn't noticed before: a large, ornate mirror standing against the wall, its glass cracked in a few places. It seemed out of place in the otherwise neglected space. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to it, but I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at the faded reflection. The cracks in the glass created a strange pattern that distorted my face, giving it an almost monstrous look. For a moment I was hypnotized by it. The more I stared, the more I felt like something was watching me from within the glass. I shook off the sensation, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old house, and old houses had a way of making you feel things that weren't real. But something nagged at me, and I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. That night, I lay awake in bed, hearing the occasional creak of the house settling. But I couldn't get the image of that cracked mirror out of my mind. The way it seemed so out of place, so deliberate in its position in the basement. I couldn't sleep. I needed to go back. I told myself I was just being foolish, but I found myself descending the stairs again, flashlight in hand. The basement was colder than I remembered, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite identify. I reached the corner where the mirror stood and froze. The room seemed different. It felt heavier somehow, like it had changed since I had last been down here. The mirror, it was now facing me. It hadn't been turned when I left. I was certain of that. But now it stood there, its surface gleaming faintly in the flashlight's glow. I stepped closer, feeling an unsettling chill crawl up my spine. My reflection in the mirror was still distorted, but something was wrong. My face was too pale, my eyes too wide, and my mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I blinked, trying to focus, but the reflection didn't change. It only grew more distorted, more unnatural. My reflection moved on its own, its eyes locked on mine, and a slow, deliberate grin spread across its face. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it wasn't me. I backed away, turning to leave, but as I turned, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun back around to face the mirror. The reflection was no longer just standing there. It was moving. It was coming toward me, stepping out of the mirror, its foot bridging the gap between the glass and the real world. My blood ran cold. I turned and ran up the stairs, my pulse racing in my ears. The steps creaked under my feet as I sprinted through the house, not daring to look back. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I stayed up all night, every little sound making me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was watching, waiting. The next morning, I went back to the basement, too terrified to ignore it any longer. The door was locked, but when I opened it, I was met with an empty room. The mirror was gone. It wasn't just moved, it was gone. The space where it had been was bare, the wall untouched. I searched the basement from corner to corner, but there was no sign of it. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things and left. I didn't care that I had signed a lease. I couldn't be in that house anymore. But even now, months later, I still feel its presence. I dream of the mirror sometimes. I see my reflection, smiling that twisted smile, and I can hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me through the dark. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I think I hear the faint creak of a door opening, as if someone or something is descending into the basement once again. I know I won't be going back, but I can't shake the feeling that the house is still calling me, still waiting for me to return, to look into that mirror and face what lies on the other side. It was a rainy night when I got the call. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was crackling, and there was a sense of urgency in his tone. I was working the late shift as a delivery driver for a small logistics company. We typically made late-night deliveries for restaurants and businesses, but nothing too unusual until that night. "Got a special delivery for you," the dispatcher said. "It's a priority order, needs to go out now. Address is 225 Millstone Road. You're the closest driver. I'll send the details to your GPS." I didn't ask questions. I had worked this job long enough to know that sometimes there were unusual requests. It wasn't the first time I'd been sent to strange places in the middle of the night. But something about this one didn't sit right with me. The address was in the middle of nowhere, well beyond the usual routes. Millstone Road was in a remote part of town, surrounded by farmland and dense woods. The kind of place people lived if they wanted to be left alone. I checked the GPS. The route looked odd, as if the house was buried in the middle of nowhere, a long dark stretch of road with only fields on either side. But I shrugged it off and started my drive. It wasn't like I had much choice. The rain had picked up by the time I left the city, turning the road into a slick, dangerous mess. The wipers barely kept up with the downpour, and the headlights cut through the dark in sharp, narrow beams. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like miles. As I made the turn onto Millstone Road, I felt the air change. It wasn't just the rain or the isolation. It was a kind of heaviness, like the world had become eerily silent. The radio went out and my phone signal dropped entirely. I told myself it was just the storm messing with everything, but it felt wrong, unnaturally wrong. The house finally appeared, looming in the distance as I rounded a bend. It was a large, old farmhouse, its windows dark, save for a single light in the upstairs window. The driveway was long, unpaved, and lined with overgrown grass. I pulled up to the front of the house, my headlights cutting through the misty rain. It was too quiet. I stepped out of the truck and walked up to the front door, carrying the package. It was a small box, no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address. No indication of who the delivery was for. I could barely make out the house number on the mailbox, 225 Millstone. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to leave when I heard a faint sound from inside. It was the sound of a door creaking open. I waited, straining to hear more, but nothing came. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open slightly, calling out, "Hello? Delivery for 225 Millstone Road." There was no reply. The house felt dark, cold, almost abandoned. But something told me to go inside. I stepped over the threshold, my heart hammering in my chest as the door creaked shut behind me. The inside was eerily still. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and the faint smell of old wood. I called out again, "Is anyone home?" But my voice sounded muffled, as if the house itself was swallowing the words. I started walking through the house, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The hallway was narrow, with old portraits lining the walls. The photos were faded, some so old I couldn't even make out the faces. I could feel a presence in the air, an unsettling feeling like someone was watching me. I reached the living room, but it was empty. The only sound was the faint tapping of rain against the windows. I made my way further into the house, the floorboards creaking louder with each step. It felt like I was trespassing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to deliver the package. I moved through the kitchen and then to the staircase that led upstairs. The faint light I had seen earlier flickered from the top. It was coming from one of the rooms upstairs. I walked slowly up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. At the top of the stairs I saw it. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, the light spilling out into the dark corridor. I took a deep breath and walked toward it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. When I pushed the door open, I froze. The room was small, almost sterile, with old furniture draped in white sheets. But it wasn't the room itself that made me stop. It was the figure standing in front of the window. A tall man, his back to me, staring out the window into the storm. His figure was almost skeletal, his posture stiff like a mannequin. I stood frozen, my throat tight. The strange thing was that I could see his reflection in the glass. He was smiling, an unnaturally wide smile, his lips stretched so far back it looked painful. I didn't know why, but I turned and ran out of the room. My heart was pounding and my legs felt like they were made of stone. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me down the stairs. I ran faster, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I had to get out. I had to leave. I didn't stop until I was back in the truck, the engine roaring to life. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the road was barely visible. But I didn't care. I slammed the pedal to the metal and drove. I didn't look back until I reached the end of Millstone Road, and when I did, I saw it. Just for a moment. The man standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at me. I drove straight to the police station, but when I explained what had happened, they told me the house had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. They even showed me a photograph of the house. No lights on in the window, no signs of life. But that night still haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is still waiting on Millstone Road, waiting for the next delivery. And I swear, every time it rains, I hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I never thought a late-night detour would change my life. I was driving home after a long day at work, exhausted but eager to get to bed. The highway was practically empty, the only sound being the hum of my car's engine and the occasional swipe of the windshield wipers clearing away the rain. That's when I saw it, sitting by the side of the road just past a sharp curve. A car alone, its engine off, headlights dim. It looked out of place, especially in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses around, just a thick, dark forest stretching on either side. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. The car's hazard lights were blinking, but there was no sign of the driver. I could have just kept going. I should have. But something about the situation nagged at me. Maybe it was the rain, maybe the isolation, but I couldn't ignore it. I pulled over to the side, telling myself I'd just check to see if the person needed help. I stepped out into the heavy rain, the cold air hitting my face. The car was an older model, one I didn't recognize. Its paint was chipped, its tires worn down as though it had been sitting here for a while. No visible damage though. No broken windows, no flat tires. Just abandoned. I knocked on the window, my hand tapping lightly against the glass. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated. The car didn't seem like it had been involved in an accident. Maybe someone had simply run out of gas or needed a quick break. But there was something unsettling about the whole thing. The car was parked just far enough off the road to look like it had been deliberately placed there, but there was no one around. I walked around to the back, checking the trunk, half expecting to find a set of keys or a phone. But when I opened the trunk, the smell hit me, something foul, rotten, like something had been left inside for days, maybe longer. My stomach churned and I slammed the trunk shut, stepping back quickly. I turned to head back to my car, but then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a groan, coming from the woods behind me. I froze, my heart racing. The rain was so heavy now it was hard to hear anything clearly, but the sound persisted, close but not too close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I glanced around, but I couldn't see anything in the thick darkness beyond the trees. My instincts told me to leave, to get back in my car and drive away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching me. I started walking quickly toward my car, my eyes scanning the shadows, the rain slapping against my face. But just as I reached the driver's side door, I heard the sound again, louder this time. A rasping breath, followed by a soft shuffle, like footsteps in the wet leaves. It was coming from the woods. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned around to face the dark stretch of trees, my pulse racing. There, in the corner of my vision, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, just at the edge of the forest. I couldn't make out any details, but I saw the glint of pale skin in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait to find out who, or what, it was. I yanked the car door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone behind me, but the image of that figure lingered in my mind. I threw the car into gear and sped off, not caring about the road or the rain, just wanting to put as much distance between myself and that thing in the woods. I didn't look back until I reached the next town, my heart still hammering in my chest. But when I passed the gas station, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The car, the one I had just stopped to check on, was in the parking lot. It was parked in the same position with its headlights dim, just like before. Only this time the door was open and there was no one in sight. I drove past, my stomach turning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the way it had been standing there, watching me. I didn't go back. I couldn't. When I called the police to report the abandoned car, they told me they had no record of a vehicle matching the description. They suggested I must have imagined the whole thing. But it wasn't just the car. It was the way everything felt wrong. The smell in the trunk, the figure in the woods, the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was following me that night, but I know it wasn't human. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the car is still out there waiting. And sometimes when I'm driving alone on a dark, rainy night, I can't help but glance at the side of the road, half expecting to see the car again, parked quietly in the shadows. But I never stop. I never will. And I never want to know what's waiting for the next person who does. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. A cabin in the woods, far away from the noise of city life. Just me, my girlfriend, and a few days of peace and relaxation. We had rented the cabin off some obscure listing online. The pictures showed a cozy place with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking a vast forest. It looked perfect for what we were hoping for, a break from everything. We arrived around dusk, the sun low behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading to the cabin. The weather was crisp, the air cool, with a faint scent of pine in the wind. As we pulled up, I could already feel the solitude of the place settling in. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. There were no other houses in sight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just the quiet of nature. It was a deep, unnerving silence. Even the usual hum of insects or the chirping of birds seemed absent. I brushed it off as a quirk of the location. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. Still, something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. We unpacked our things, settled into the cabin, and spent the evening by the fire, talking and laughing. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't obvious. Just this nagging sense that the woods were alive, that something was lurking just beyond the trees. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I didn't want to ruin the trip with silly fears, especially when my girlfriend was clearly enjoying herself. But the unease lingered. Around midnight, we decided to take a walk outside. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light over the forest. It felt peaceful at first, the cool air biting at our cheeks, our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath us. But as we walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The trees seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker, thicker. Then we heard it, soft at first, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. A voice. It wasn't clear, just a series of unintelligible murmurs carried by the wind. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, just echoing through the trees surrounding us. I froze. I could feel my heart start to race. My girlfriend noticed my hesitation and asked if I heard it too. I nodded. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as just the wind playing tricks. But I didn't believe it. The voice sounded too distinct, too purposeful, like it was calling to us. We walked a little further, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, between two trees, was a faint light. A small flickering like the glow of a lantern. It didn't make sense. There was no one else around. No roads, no trails, nothing that would suggest anyone was out here. "Let's go check it out," I said, though my voice didn't feel like mine. It was as if something was pushing me forward, urging me into the darkness. My girlfriend hesitated but agreed, following me as I walked toward the light. We moved quietly. The only sounds now were our footsteps and the strange murmurs carried by the wind. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, but it was dim, almost as if it were flickering on and off like a dying flame. Then suddenly it stopped. The light vanished. I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest around us was now completely dark, the moon obscured by clouds. The whispers had stopped too, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. But there was something else now, something far worse. A distant rustling, like something moving through the trees. I grabbed my girlfriend's arm, pulling her close. My breath was quick and shallow, my mind racing. We turned back toward the cabin, trying to make our way out of the woods as quickly as possible. But the deeper we went, the more lost we seemed to get. It felt like the trees were closing in, like we were walking in circles. The path we had come from no longer visible. I checked my phone, no signal. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the woods. We were alone, completely alone. Then we heard it, the voice again. This time it was clearer. It wasn't just a whisper now, it was distinct, words in an ancient language I didn't recognize. I could feel my blood run cold. The voice wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from behind us. I spun around, but there was nothing there. We started running then. Panic set in and all rational thought disappeared. We just had to get out. We stumbled, tripping over roots and branches, pushing through the underbrush. The rustling in the trees was getting closer now. It was following us like it had been for a long time, waiting for us to wander too far from safety. I don't know how long we ran, minutes, hours, it felt like time itself had stopped. The only thing that mattered was getting back to the cabin. But then, just when I thought we might be close, the woods around us grew darker still. We couldn't see the path. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the flickering light again just beyond the trees. I didn't want to go toward it, but my feet moved as if they had a mind of their own. I couldn't stop. I had to see what it was. We stumbled forward, desperate, and as we reached the source of the light, I felt my stomach drop. There, hanging from a tree by thick ropes, were dozens of small human-like figures. Their eyes were wide open, their faces frozen in silent screams. They weren't real people, they were dolls. Old, tattered dolls with lifelike eyes, their mouths sewn shut. They swung slowly in the wind, their glassy eyes fixed on us. My girlfriend screamed, pulling me away, and we ran back the way we came, finally bursting through the trees and back into the clearing near the cabin. We didn't speak much after that. We packed up and left immediately, no questions asked. We didn't even wait to check out. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. To this day, I can still hear the whisper sometimes. Not every night, but on the nights when the wind is just right, and the trees sway in that particular way. It's as though they're still out there, calling me to return. But I know better now. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. It was a typical Friday night. After a long work week, I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, alone. The apartment was dimly lit, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise silent space. I had ordered takeout, and as I settled in to eat, the wind outside began to pick up, tapping lightly against the windows. Around 9 p.m., the lights flickered. I didn't think much of it. Power outages were common in the area, especially with the storm moving in. But then the lights went out completely. The apartment was plunged into darkness. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the power to come back on. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my friend Sarah, asking if I had lost power as well. I typed back quickly, "Yeah, looks like it." I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started looking around for candles. The storm outside had picked up. I could hear the wind howling and the rain beating against the windows. My apartment building had old wiring, so blackouts were not uncommon. Still, something about the storm felt different tonight, heavier. As I moved through the apartment, I noticed a strange noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but then I heard it again. Soft footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Someone was walking down the hallway outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't expect anyone to be in the building at this hour, especially with the storm. The building was quiet. Everyone had their own lives and, for the most part, stayed to themselves. The footsteps stopped outside my door and I froze. I waited, hoping it was nothing, just someone from another apartment, maybe just checking their mail or something. But then I heard it. A soft knock on the door, gentle at first, but then more insistent, as though whoever it was really wanted to get my attention. I slowly moved towards the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. My pulse quickened and I backed away from the door, confused. There was no one there. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Was someone just playing a prank? But the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The apartment building was old, and I knew there were a few strange characters who lived here. Still, this was different. The knock wasn't the typical random noise you'd expect from a drunk neighbor. It felt deliberate. I decided to call Sarah just to have someone on the phone, even if it was just for comfort. She didn't answer. I left a quick voicemail telling her what had happened, then returned to the door. I cautiously opened it a crack, just enough to peek out. Nothing. No one was in the hallway. But the strange feeling lingered. I stepped back into the apartment, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, looking for anything out of place. I checked the locks on the door and the windows, making sure everything was secure. The storm outside raged harder now, the wind shrieking through the cracks in the old building. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker. They went completely out, followed by a loud bang from somewhere in the building. The kind of noise you hear when a heavy object hits the floor. I froze. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but the screen stayed black. Panic started to creep in. The phone, the lights, everything felt like it was shutting down at once. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling wind outside and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they weren't outside the door. They were coming from inside my apartment. I turned quickly, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand, but the apartment was still empty. No one was there. But the footsteps kept coming, slowly, deliberately, like someone was pacing just out of view. My stomach churned, and I began to back away towards the kitchen, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to call someone, get out, maybe even break the window if I had to. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew it wasn't normal. I turned to the hallway where the noise seemed to be coming from. The kitchen light was still off, but I could see the faint glow of the street lights through the blinds. The wind outside howled louder, but the footsteps, now closer, drowned it out. I didn't know if I could make it to the phone before whatever was in the apartment reached me. My breath was ragged now, my thoughts clouded by panic. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer. It felt like the only thing I had left to defend myself with. But as I stood there holding the knife, I heard the footsteps stop. Complete silence filled the room. And then the phone rang. I nearly dropped the knife in surprise. It was Sarah. Her voice, shaky and breathless, came through the line. "Are you okay? I was trying to call you, but I couldn't get through. There's something weird going on with the power, and then I heard someone at my door. It's like the whole building is." Her voice cut off abruptly, and then I heard something I'll never forget, an unfamiliar voice, distorted and hollow, whispering through the phone. "Get out." I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, knife still clutched in my hand. But as I turned the handle, the door swung open on its own. A figure stood in the dark hallway, tall, gaunt, its eyes hollow and wide. It didn't move, just stared at me. I screamed, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know where to go, what to do. I backed into the corner, still gripping the knife. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. The power was back on now, the lights flickering weakly overhead, but the building felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, I left the apartment and spent the rest of the weekend in a hotel. I never went back. I tried to get answers from the building manager, but they said there were no issues, no complaints from anyone else. It's as though nothing happened at all. But I know what I saw, what I heard. And sometimes late at night, when the power goes out or the wind picks up, I can still hear those footsteps. Still feel that presence waiting just beyond the door. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again in a place that's supposed to be home. It had been a long week. The kind of week where you just want to come home, lock the doors, and not talk to anyone. My job at the office was draining, and I hadn't had any time to unwind, so when the weekend rolled around, I was eager for a break. I live in a small, quiet apartment complex on the edge of the city. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and eat. It's the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens, which is just the way I liked it. On that particular Friday evening, the weather was strange. The sun had set early, and the air had that sharp, chilly edge to it, even though it was the middle of fall. The wind kept making odd noises like someone was tapping on the windows, but when I checked, there was nothing. It was the kind of evening that made the shadows outside seem deeper than usual, as if the night was swallowing everything up. I had just finished making dinner when the knock came at my door. It wasn't the typical soft knock that you get from a neighbor wanting to borrow sugar or ask about the noise. It was louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get your attention. I stood there for a moment, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't had any visitors in weeks. I hesitated, wondering if it was a mistake or maybe a delivery I had forgotten about. I walked to the door, peered through the peephole, and saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the door slowly, my eyes scanning the darkened corridor. There was no one there. I stepped outside, looking both ways, but there was no one in sight. Just the faint sound of the wind. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the overhead fixture casting strange shadows on the walls. I was about to turn back into my apartment when I noticed something on the ground. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was erratic, rushed, almost as if the person had been in a hurry. Read, asterisk, he's here. Don't answer the door. He knows. Asterisk. My skin crawled. Who would leave something like that at my door? Who would even know anything about me? I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. I stood there, staring at the note, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't told anyone about my plans, and no one had any reason to know where I lived. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. My eyes flicked nervously to the peephole, almost expecting someone to be standing outside, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was probably some kind of prank, I told myself. Someone from the building messing with me. But then I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound wasn't like someone trying to open the door, but more like something alive, was scraping against it. I took a step back, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was a tree branch brushing against the door. But no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I backed away from the door and stood still, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, and then, in a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine, I heard it. "Let me in." The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was deep, rough, and filled with something desperate. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened. I stood there in complete silence, not daring to make a sound. Another knock. Louder this time, more forceful. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voice came again, closer this time. "I know you're there." My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge what was on the other side of that door, but the fear kept me rooted to the spot. The doorknob began to turn. I couldn't believe it. How was this happening? Who was trying to break in? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a chair, and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking. The door shuddered under the pressure of the turning handle, as though someone was trying to force it open from the other side. The scratching resumed, faster now, more frantic. It was as if the thing on the other side knew it was close, knew it was almost through. My phone. I needed to call for help. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for options, but when I reached for my phone, it was dead. The screen flickered before going completely black. I couldn't even make an emergency call. I ran to the window and threw it open, desperate for any escape, but the ledge was too narrow to climb out. The building's outer walls were too high, the drop too far. Panic set in. I stumbled toward the bathroom, grabbing anything I could to defend myself. A towel rack, a shampoo bottle, anything. But the knocking didn't stop. It was becoming relentless. The voice, now more frantic, began whispering my name, softly at first, then louder, almost pleading. I could feel it. The presence on the other side pushing against the door inch by inch. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't even human. It was something else, something that shouldn't be real. Finally, the door gave way. Not from the force of the knocking, but from a sudden silence that fell over everything. The door creaked, the handle turning slowly, deliberately, and then it swung open. There was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway, silent as it had been before. The light from the corridor flickered, casting shadows in every corner. But I didn't care. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the cold night air. The apartment building behind me looked the same, the lights in the windows twinkling like nothing had ever happened. I looked back one last time, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing in the doorway. But the hallway was empty. I don't live there anymore. I moved out the next week after a few more nights of strange occurrences. The building manager found nothing wrong with the locks or the doors, and when I asked the neighbors, no one had seen or heard anything. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And I know I'm not going back. The visitor never left. Is still out there. I had always been a creature of habit. I lived alone in a modest apartment on the third floor of an old building in the city. It was one of those places that, on the surface, seemed normal enough, but had that creeping, quiet energy, like it was just a bit too far from everything, like it didn't quite fit in. Most of the time, I didn't mind the isolation. I was a freelance graphic designer, so working from home meant I was used to quiet evenings, long hours in front of my computer, and the occasional takeout dinner. The neighborhood wasn't bad, at least that's what I thought. That is, until it started happening. It was subtle at first. I'd be sitting at my desk working on a project and I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow maybe shifting across the window. It wasn't anything I could point to, nothing that seemed out of place, but it was enough to make me pause for a second. It happened a few times, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone for too long. Then one evening it escalated. I had just settled in for the night, a warm cup of tea beside me, the faint glow of my computer screen illuminating the dim room. I had a sense of déjà vu as I glanced up at the window. The curtains were drawn, but there was a gap, a small one, just wide enough to let in a sliver of streetlight. I thought I saw movement outside, but when I checked there was nothing. Just a flicker of light, nothing more. But this time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My heart raced a little faster than usual, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired. I got up, turned off the computer, and went into the kitchen to make a quick snack. When I came back, I froze. The curtains had been pulled back just a little more than I remembered them being. I walked over to them, feeling uneasy, and gently tugged them back into place. That's when I noticed it. There was a figure across the street, standing just outside a darkened storefront. It was hard to make out any details, just a silhouette against the dim streetlight. But what I could see was enough to make my stomach twist. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and facing my window. I tried to convince myself it was just a passerby. Maybe someone waiting for a bus or just standing there lost in thought. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, as though the person was waiting for me to notice them. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the shadowy figure. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. Not toward the building, but away. I don't know how long I stood there watching, but eventually I moved away from the window. My mind raced. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been waiting. I checked the locks on all my doors and windows before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that presence in the back of my mind, like someone was standing just outside my door, waiting, watching. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had all been in my head. Maybe I had been overworked, maybe it was just a shadow I'd misinterpreted. But as the day went on, the memory of the figure wouldn't leave me, and neither would the unease. That night, when I returned home, I felt a sense of dread the moment I walked through the door. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew something was different. The apartment felt colder. The air was thick with the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being suffocated. I checked the window again. This time, I didn't see anyone, but I had that same nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I pulled the curtains shut, double-checked the locks, and made my way to the living room, hoping I could shake the feeling. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when it happened again, louder, more insistent, I knew it wasn't. I slowly stood up, my body rigid with fear. I couldn't look out the window again. I didn't want to see anything. But the tapping continued, rapid, like fingers drumming against the glass. I reached for my phone, but it had no signal. I grabbed my keys, my hands trembling as I looked for an escape, but all I could hear was that tapping. It was maddening, unrelenting. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place, as the tapping continued, each beat echoing louder in the silent apartment. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then the doorbell rang. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the door. I wanted to open it. I needed to know who was on the other side. But something in me held me back. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps just beyond the door. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. I finally found the strength to move. Slowly, I inched toward the door, but I didn't open it. Instead, I pressed my eye to the peephole, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. Just an empty hallway. I stepped back, confusion and fear flooding my mind. Who had been ringing the bell? I didn't know what to do. I stayed inside for the rest of the night, too terrified to go outside, too scared to even look through the window. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. The blinds had been pulled back again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I packed up what I could, left my apartment, and didn't look back. I don't know who that figure was or why they had been watching me, but I don't think it was a coincidence. I think it knew me. It knew where I lived, and it had been waiting for something. To this day, I've never gone back to that apartment. I moved to a new place far away, hoping I could leave the fear behind. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the tapping. And sometimes I wonder if it's still waiting, just outside the window. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural, not really. My life had always been grounded in logic and reason. I was the type of person who would laugh off ghost stories and explain away any strange occurrence with a simple, scientific explanation. But that all changed one night, when I encountered something I couldn't explain. Something I still can't explain. It was a Friday evening, a little after dusk, when I first noticed it. I had just moved into a new apartment. It was small but cozy, perfect for someone like me who spent most of their time at work. The apartment had this old-world charm to it. The hardwood floors, the antique light fixtures, and yes, the slightly creaky windows that let in a draft when it was windy. Nothing unusual, just the kind of place that had history. The building itself was over 100 years old, and though it had been renovated, there was still an air of mystery that clung to the walls. I had just finished unpacking and was settling down in front of the TV when I noticed the mirror. It was hanging on the far wall of the living room. I hadn't given it much thought when I moved in, but now that I was sitting in the room, I couldn't help but glance over at it. It was an old mirror, the kind that you could tell was from another time, etched edges, a slight tarnish around the frame. At first, everything seemed fine. The room looked as it should, bathed in the soft glow of the table lamp beside me. But then, as my eyes lingered on the mirror, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the reflection. I froze. The figure was me, or at least it looked like me at first glance. But there was something wrong about it. The reflection of my face was different. It was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed too dark. The corners of my mouth were curled into a smile, but it wasn't my smile. It was twisted, malevolent. And the worst part? The reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. I blinked, and the figure in the mirror blinked too, but then it did something I didn't do. It grinned wider, its eyes narrowing into something that looked far too knowing, far too sinister. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I forced myself to look away from the mirror, standing up quickly, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I was overtired, or the angle of the mirror was creating some kind of optical illusion. But when I looked back, the figure was still there, still grinning, still not quite me. I walked over to the mirror, my heart pounding. I reached out with shaky hands to touch the surface, half expecting it to be cold or somehow wrong, but it felt just like any other mirror. Smooth, reflective. I ran my fingers along the frame, feeling the dust of age beneath my fingertips. There was nothing that would explain the twisted reflection. I didn't sleep that night. The next few days were worse. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt that same dread creeping over me. The figure wasn't always there, but I felt its presence. And when it did appear, it was always different. Sometimes its eyes were closed, sometimes it was laughing, sometimes it just stood there, staring back at me with that unnerving, crooked smile. I tried to avoid the mirror as much as I could. I'd walk around the living room, avoiding that corner where it hung, or I'd turn the other way when I had to pass it. But no matter what I did, it was always there, lurking at the edge of my vision. The reflection never left me alone. I finally did the only thing I could think of. I covered it up. I draped a thick, dark cloth over the mirror, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it would stop haunting me. But even that didn't help. The unease lingered, as if the reflection was still watching, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. That night, I fell asleep with the cloth still covering the mirror, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could get some rest. Around 3 a.m. I woke up suddenly. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt thick with tension. The room was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached over to turn on the lamp beside my bed, but it flickered and then went out completely, leaving me in complete darkness. I sat up, straining my eyes to see anything in the blackness. Then I heard it, a low guttural sound like something scraping against the walls. The mirror. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the wall where the mirror hung. The cloth covering it rustled, as though something was pushing against it from the other side. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The sound of the scraping was deafening now, almost like nails on glass. And then the cloth was pulled away. I don't know how it happened, but when I looked up, the cloth was gone, and the mirror was exposed again. The figure was there, standing in the reflection, but it wasn't just grinning anymore. It was moving. It was reaching toward me. Its hand, twisted and pale, was pressed against the glass, inches away from me, as if it were trying to reach through. I screamed, but no sound came out. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but the doorknob wouldn't turn. It was as if the very air had thickened, holding me inside. I felt something cold, something unnatural brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, but the mirror was gone. The wall was bare. Nothing. It was like the mirror had never existed. I moved out the next morning. I didn't even look back. But every time I pass a reflective surface now, a window, a car mirror, a storefront, I feel it. That same cold, sick feeling. And I can't shake the memory of the reflection staring back at me, waiting. I'm not sure what it was or if it's still out there, but I know one thing. I'll never look into a mirror the same way again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months. Just a short drive to a cabin deep in the woods, away from the chaos of city life. The kind of place where you could disconnect from the world, breathe in fresh air, and just relax. We had rented the cabin from an old man who lived nearby. He assured us it would be a perfect retreat. He even gave us the key in person, a smile on his face as he handed it over, his old eyes twinkling in the fading sunlight. When we arrived at the cabin, it seemed just as perfect as he described. The exterior was weathered but solid, with a rustic charm that felt authentic. The cabin was isolated, nestled between tall trees that blocked out most of the sky, their branches swaying in the gentle breeze. It was quiet, eerily quiet, almost as if the world outside had ceased to exist. We settled in quickly, unpacking our bags and preparing for a few days of relaxation. The first night was uneventful, and we spent it around the fire pit outside, telling stories and drinking beers under the stars. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant call of owls. It was peaceful until the second night. That's when things started to feel off. We had all retreated inside to the cabin after dark. The warmth of the fire had left us feeling drowsy, and we decided to call it a night. The air inside the cabin was warm and smelled faintly of wood and cedar. I was sharing a room with my friend Hannah, and we had both climbed into bed, exhausted from the long drive and the night's festivities. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard something. It started as a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it might be a branch hitting the cabin from the wind, but the noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. It sounded like something, or someone, was tapping against the window. My first instinct was to ignore it. It was probably just an animal or some leftover noise from the wind. But as the tapping continued, it grew louder, more insistent. And then, I swear I heard a voice, muffled, almost as if it were coming from the other side of the wall. I could feel my heart rate spike as I turned to Hannah, but she was already sitting up, her eyes wide. She had heard it too. The tapping stopped, but the air in the room felt thick with tension. We both tried to lie back down, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the sound again. This time it was louder, closer. A slow, deliberate scratching, right against the window. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of it. There was no breeze tonight. Whatever it was real. I got out of bed, heart racing, and cautiously made my way to the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled back the curtain. Outside, the moonlight cast long shadows across the forest, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person. just the trees. Relieved, I turned to Hannah and shrugged, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then, as I turned back to the window to close the curtain, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The reflection. A figure, just a shadow at first, standing behind me. I froze, staring into the glass. It was a tall man dressed in old, ragged clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He was standing so close to the window that I could barely make out his features, but there was something wrong about him. The way his head tilted unnaturally to the side. The way his hands were outstretched, fingers curled as if reaching for something. I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I whispered to Hannah, but she was already standing at the door, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said. But it was too late. The door handle rattled violently, and then the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps, came from the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see the door shaking. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to break through. We ran for the back door, but the moment we stepped outside, the cold hit us like a slap in the face. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the forest itself was pressing in on us. The cabin stood behind us like a dark, looming figure. We didn't dare look back as we sprinted into the woods, the sound of dragging footsteps following us. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where a car passed by, its headlights blinding in the darkness. We flagged it down, and the driver agreed to take us to the nearest town. We never went back to the cabin. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was the old man's presence lingering in the woods or something far worse, but I haven't been able to forget the sound of those dragging footsteps. I've heard them once or twice since, always in the dead of night, when the air feels too still. The memory of that reflection, the figure standing behind me reaching out, haunts me still. Maybe it was the cabin itself. Maybe it was something older, something more malevolent that had been there long before the old man ever came around. I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back to those woods again. I've always enjoyed working from home. The quiet, the comfort of my own space, and the lack of distractions make it easy for me to focus. But recently, something strange happened that I still can't explain. It all started with a simple job interview. I had been contacted by a company I was excited to work with, so when they offered me a position in another city, I jumped at the chance. It was a short-term contract, just a few months, but I thought it would be a good opportunity. They booked me a nice hotel for the duration of the assignment, an older building with a mix of modern amenities and vintage charm. The kind of place that feels familiar even though you've never been there before. I arrived around late afternoon and was greeted by the receptionist, a friendly woman who seemed eager to help. She gave me the key to my room, a simple brass key, and reminded me that if I needed anything to just let them know. The room was perfect. It was on the third floor, spacious, with a large window overlooking the street below. The walls were a soft cream color, with patterned carpets and a small, old-fashioned writing desk in the corner. It looked cozy, almost like a room from a different time. I unpacked and settled in quickly, enjoying the peace and quiet. The first night went smoothly. I had dinner at a nearby restaurant and then returned to the hotel. When I entered the room, I noticed something strange. The door to the closet was slightly ajar. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way when I put my clothes away. But when I went to close it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The closet was empty, except for a small handwritten note lying on the floor. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was brief and to the point. "You shouldn't have stayed here." I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was some kind of weird prank or just a coincidence, but I decided to brush it off. I locked the door behind me and went to bed. The next few days passed without incident. Work kept me busy and I didn't think much about the note again. But each night, something odd would happen. The closet door would always be slightly ajar when I returned to the room. Not wide open, just enough that I could see the dark space inside. I began checking it each time, always expecting to find nothing, but one night, something was different. The door wasn't just ajar. It was locked. I stood frozen in front of it for a few moments. The lock on the closet was old like the rest of the room, but it was solid, and it had never been locked before. I tried the handle several times, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone had locked it from the inside. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept imagining that there was someone in the closet. A person hidden, waiting for me to make a mistake. But when morning came, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, the hotel staff was always so friendly, and no one had given me any reason to be suspicious. The following evening, after returning from work, I found the door unlocked again. But the note was back, resting on the floor. "Don't go near it." I was terrified now. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. There was no way the hotel staff was involved. I had checked out all the other rooms when I walked by, and no one was acting strangely. Still, something about the note felt different. It was too specific, too personal. How could they know I had been near the closet? That night, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let whatever this was control me. I grabbed a chair and wedged it beneath the closet handle, hoping to block whatever might try to come out. Then I stood by the window, keeping my back to the door. I told myself I was being foolish, but the air in the room felt heavier, thicker. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again. A quiet scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. I froze. The sound came from the closet. I didn't move, didn't dare turn around. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. It sounded as if someone was trying to break out from the inside. In a burst of panic, I ran to the door, yanked it open, and slammed it behind me as I stepped into the hallway. My heart was pounding, my body drenched in sweat. The hallway was empty, silent. I didn't know what to do. I thought of going to the front desk, but what would I say? That there was something locked in the closet? That the room felt haunted? I couldn't explain it. No one would believe me. I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, watching the clock tick by, too terrified to return to the room. In the morning, I checked out early, my bags packed, my hands shaking. I told the receptionist I couldn't stay another night. She seemed surprised, but didn't press me for details. I never went back to that hotel. To this day, I don't know what was in that room. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I'm never staying in a hotel again without checking the closet first. I've always been the type to enjoy road trips. There's something freeing about the open road, the wind in your hair, and the idea that you're in control of where you're going. But that control was taken away from me in a way I'll never forget, during a trip that started off as an ordinary journey and ended in a nightmare. It was supposed to be a quick drive to visit some family. I had to take an old highway to avoid the traffic of the major interstates, and I was looking forward to the solitude. The drive was peaceful at first. The trees were thick on either side of the road, and the sun was setting slowly behind me, casting long shadows on the asphalt. The kind of peaceful that makes you feel like you could just drive forever. I didn't realize how isolated the road was until I was already deep into it. There weren't many cars, just an occasional truck passing by. My phone had no service, and the radio was mostly static, except for a faint signal from an old country station that played in the background. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. My gas light came on. I hadn't planned on stopping, but I hadn't realized how far out I was. The nearest gas station, according to the map, was still about 20 miles away. I wasn't too worried. I had plenty of time. The problem started when my car started sputtering. It wasn't the usual low fuel stutter. It was as if the engine itself was starting to give up. I managed to coast the car to the side of the road and shut it off. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the eerie silence around me. No other cars, no sound of animals, just the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. I tried restarting the engine, but it wouldn't catch. I looked at my phone again, no signal. The gas station on the map was a dot, and nothing around me seemed familiar. The road was empty. I debated whether to try walking to the gas station or wait for help, but the decision was made for me when I saw headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me as I thought a car was coming. I could get help. But as the car drew closer, I noticed something that made me uneasy. The headlights didn't look like they were coming down the road toward me. They were coming from behind the trees, from an area I was certain had no road. The car came closer and I could see it now. A large old pickup truck with faded red paint and no lights other than the headlights. It was moving slowly, but there was something off about it. It seemed to glide like it wasn't even touching the ground. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to act quickly. I grabbed my emergency flashlight, opened the door, and stepped out. I waved my arms, desperate for attention. The truck slowed down, but it didn't stop. It kept moving, pulling off the road and slowing even further as it passed me. I was left in the darkness, frozen in place, watching the truck continue down the road. It didn't stop. It didn't even seem to notice me. I turned to get back in my car when I heard something behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the road was empty. There were no lights, no sign of the truck, and no sound except for the wind. I turned my attention back to the car. It was still dead, the engine unresponsive. I had no choice now but to try walking. I grabbed my bag and set off, following the map's direction toward the gas station. I don't know how long I walked, but at some point I felt the overwhelming sense that I was being followed. It wasn't footsteps, but something heavier, moving in the distance behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the road, the trees, the night. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance. The gas station finally. I walked faster, my legs aching, my thoughts spinning. But when I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The gas station wasn't open. It was abandoned. The building was dark, windows boarded up, and the pumps were rusted over with grime. There was no one around. I was close to panic now, standing in the dark with no phone signal, no way to get help. I looked around again, trying to find some sign of life, but the silence pressed in from all sides. Then I heard it, the rumble of an engine, not from the station, but from behind me. I turned, but I already knew what I was going to see. The same truck was there, slowly creeping up the road toward me. This time it didn't stop. The truck just kept coming, its headlights fixed on me, glaring like eyes in the darkness. I don't know how I managed to make it back to my car. The truck kept getting closer, but the fear that had paralyzed me earlier suddenly shifted into an overwhelming need to escape. I ran back down the road toward my car, and when I got there, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and tried the engine again. This time, miraculously, it started. I sped away, not daring to look back. My car sputtered, but it kept running, and I didn't stop until I reached a town with service again. When I pulled into a gas station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely pump gas. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I haven't taken that road again since. And every time I hear an old truck idling in the distance, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever be able to forget that night. I'd never imagined that a simple, quiet weekend getaway could turn into something like this. It was meant to be a break, just a few days alone at a rented cabin in the mountains. The kind of peace I'd been craving after a long stretch of stressful work. I booked the cabin weeks in advance, chosen specifically for its isolation. Far from the bustling city, surrounded by trees, no neighbors for miles. A perfect escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, but the weather was beautiful, crisp and clear. The cabin was rustic, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. A small porch, a wood-burning stove, and large windows that looked out over the valley below. It was everything I wanted, quiet, private, and cozy. I unpacked, started a fire, and settled in with a book. The only sounds were the crackling of the wood and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The first night passed without issue. I slept soundly, awoken only by the sounds of the wind howling through the trees. But things started to get strange the following day. Around noon, I went outside to explore the surrounding area. The cabin was on a small clearing surrounded by trees, and there was a trail leading into the woods. I followed the trail for a while, enjoying the stillness, but as the day wore on, I noticed something odd. There was a fresh set of footprints in the dirt. They were large, and they seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, leading up the trail from the direction of the cabin. I didn't think too much about it at first. Maybe someone else had been hiking nearby and didn't want to disturb me. But as I walked further down the trail, the footprints became more numerous, more scattered, as if someone had been walking in circles around the clearing. And then I noticed something that made my heart race. One set of footprints was coming from the woods, but the other set was heading directly toward the cabin. The direction of the prints suggested that they had been made recently, but there was no sign of anyone when I looked around. No vehicle, no people. I quickly turned back and went inside, locking the door behind me. The uneasy feeling lingered. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? There was no one for miles, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. I cautiously approached the door, looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The knock came again, this time a bit louder. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what was going on. I didn't answer the door. Instead, I grabbed my phone to call the rental agency, but the signal was out. I walked to the back window to peer out, but there was nothing. No one in sight, just the trees swaying in the wind. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Someone knocked on my door in the middle of nowhere? The next few hours passed in a blur of anxiety. I kept to myself inside the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and windows. But as the sun began to set, I heard another noise, a scraping sound coming from the side of the house. It was faint at first, like something being dragged across the ground. I couldn't place it, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tiptoed toward the back door and peered through the curtains, but again I saw nothing. Just darkness and the shadows of trees. The next morning, I woke up early to find something strange. A small, handmade wooden figurine had been placed on the porch steps. It was crudely carved, a little man holding what looked like a knife. I didn't know whether to be disturbed or confused. Who would leave something like this? As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard a voice. A low, gravelly sound coming from the woods. I froze. It wasn't quite words, but a sort of murmuring, like someone was talking to themselves, far off in the trees. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me that was a bad idea. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't want to be disturbed. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, not daring to go near the porch or any of the windows. The feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, just waiting for me to slip up. When night fell, I locked every door and window once again, pulling the heavy curtains shut. Around midnight, I heard the knock again. Soft at first, then harder. It wasn't just at the front door anymore. There was knocking at the back and on the windows. I could hear footsteps too, the unmistakable sound of someone walking around the cabin, but when I looked out, there was no one there. Just the dark woods. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. My phone still had no signal, and I was miles away from any help. I spent the night with every light on, every curtain drawn. The noises didn't stop. The knocking continued, but there was something else too. A whispering sound, like someone was calling my name. In the morning, I found the figure again, this time placed directly on my doorstep. But it was different. The carving was no longer just a man holding a knife. It was a man with a twisted, anguished face, his body contorted in an unnatural way. It was like the figure was mocking me, telling me it had been here all along, waiting for me to notice. That was when I knew something was wrong. I couldn't leave. Not without risking something worse happening. I stayed the next few nights, barely sleeping, convinced that I wasn't alone. Each day the figure would appear again, slightly altered. And each time I found it, I heard the whispering closer and closer, like it was right behind me. On the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove straight back to town, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I still have the figure, the twisted, carved man. It sits on my bookshelf, a reminder of the weekend I spent in the mountains and the neighbor I never invited. I had been working as a freelance writer for a couple of years, so I often had the flexibility to pick up projects wherever I liked. Most recently, I had been invited by a friend, Simon, to help him watch over his house while he was away on a business trip. He just moved to a small, secluded property about an hour outside of town, tucked into the woods. The house was a charming old thing, almost a farmhouse, though it wasn't exactly what I'd call modern. But it had character, and the isolation seemed like a good excuse to get some uninterrupted writing done. The moment I arrived, I could feel the air was different. I'm not talking about the usual mustiness that comes with a place that hasn't been lived in for a while, but something heavier. The house was old, sure, but there was something almost too quiet about it. Like the kind of silence you feel when everything around you has stopped, but you can't tell why. Simon had left me a note explaining the usual things, how to lock up, where to find extra towels, and how to handle the wood stove. It was a typical house-sitting situation. But the note ended with a strange line: "Don't let the house get to you. It's a little peculiar at night." It seemed like a joke, but as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The house had a strange energy, especially at night. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the wind howling outside. There was a constant, low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't loud, just barely perceptible. I could never quite figure out where it came from. On my first night there, I had trouble sleeping. I tried reading, but the low hum seemed to intensify as soon as the sun set. It wasn't a mechanical sound, no refrigerator buzzing or pipes knocking. It was just there. I figured it was just the house settling. But then, around midnight, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like fingernails gently scraping against wood. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I waited for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just another odd creak from an old house. But the sound didn't stop. It persisted, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I pulled the covers up and tried to ignore it, but after a while I couldn't. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the tapping, it was still there, just quieter now. I walked down the hallway, following the noise until I reached the kitchen. It was coming from the floorboards beneath me, the wood creaking in time with the tapping. I checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. The tapping stopped when I went back to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence returned, but it was the kind of silence that makes you think something is lurking in the shadows, waiting. The next day, I didn't mention the tapping to anyone. I figured I must have imagined it, or maybe it was just the wind. But that night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, persistent. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls, like something was trapped. I tried to ignore it, but eventually I couldn't. I grabbed my phone and sent Simon a text. "Everything okay at the house? I hear strange noises at night." He replied almost immediately, "I warned you. The house has a history. Just ignore it." His reply unsettled me more than I expected. The history he was referring to wasn't clear, and I started to wonder if there was something about this place he wasn't telling me. The tapping continued, growing louder each night. It was no longer just in the walls. It was on the floors, at the windows, behind me when I was sitting still. One evening, I decided to check the attic. Maybe there was an animal up there, knocking things around. I pulled down the wooden ladder, climbed up, and turned on the light. The room was full of dust and old furniture, but nothing that could explain the tapping. The air was cold, too cold for the time of year. I turned to leave, but as I turned the light off, I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and as I descended the attic stairs, the door slammed shut behind me. I yanked it open, almost falling down the stairs. The house was cold, unnaturally so. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, the tapping came again, but now there was something new, whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs coming from the walls. It felt like something was trying to speak, trying to get my attention. The whispering grew louder, like a chant, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my things and left the house in the middle of the night. I drove into town and stayed at a motel, trying to shake off the cold, the dread. The next morning, I called Simon again. His response was unsettling. "You left? I thought I told you. The house is like that. You weren't supposed to stay overnight." You sounded almost angry. "You shouldn't have stayed. You never should have stayed. I don't know what happened in that house, but I'll never go back." Whatever history Simon was referring to, I'm not sure I want to know. But I do know one thing. Some places don't want you to leave. I had been working as a freelance writer for a couple of years, so I often had the flexibility to pick up projects wherever I liked. Most recently, I had been invited by a friend, Simon, to help him watch over his house while he was away on a business trip. He just moved to a small, secluded property about an hour outside of town, tucked into the woods. The house was a charming old thing, almost a farmhouse, though it wasn't exactly what I'd call modern. But it had character, and the isolation seemed like a good excuse to get some uninterrupted writing done. The moment I arrived, I could feel the air was different. I'm not talking about the usual mustiness that comes with a place that hasn't been lived in for a while, but something heavier. The house was old, sure, but there was something almost too quiet about it. Like the kind of silence you feel when everything around you has stopped, but you can't tell why. Simon had left me a note explaining the usual things: how to lock up, where to find extra towels, and how to handle the wood stove. It was a typical house-sitting situation. But the note ended with a strange line: "Don't let the house get to you. It's a little peculiar at night." It seemed like a joke, but as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The house had a strange energy, especially at night. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the wind howling outside. There was a constant, low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't loud, just barely perceptible. I could never quite figure out where it came from. On my first night there, I had trouble sleeping. I tried reading, but the low hum seemed to intensify as soon as the sun set. It wasn't a mechanical sound, no refrigerator buzzing or pipes knocking. It was just there. I figured it was just the house settling. But then, around midnight, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like fingernails gently scraping against wood. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I waited for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just another odd creak from an old house. But the sound didn't stop. It persisted, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I pulled the covers up and tried to ignore it, but after a while I couldn't. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the tapping, it was still there, just quieter now. I walked down the hallway, following the noise until I reached the kitchen. It was coming from the floorboards beneath me, the wood creaking in time with the tapping. I checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. The tapping stopped when I went back to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence returned, but it was the kind of silence that makes you think something is lurking in the shadows, waiting. The next day, I didn't mention the tapping to anyone. I figured I must have imagined it, or maybe it was just the wind. But that night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, persistent. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls, like something was trapped. I tried to ignore it, but eventually I couldn't. I grabbed my phone and sent Simon a text. "Everything okay at the house? I hear strange noises at night." He replied almost immediately, "I warned you. The house has a history. Just ignore it." His reply unsettled me more than I expected. The history he was referring to wasn't clear, and I started to wonder if there was something about this place he wasn't telling me. The tapping continued, growing louder each night. It was no longer just in the walls. It was on the floors, at the windows, behind me when I was sitting still. One evening, I decided to check the attic. Maybe there was an animal up there knocking things around. I pulled down the wooden ladder, climbed up, and turned on the light. The room was full of dust and old furniture, but nothing that could explain the tapping. The air was cold, too cold for the time of year. I turned to leave, but as I turned the light off, I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and as I descended the attic stairs, the door slammed shut behind me. I yanked it open, almost falling down the stairs. The house was cold, unnaturally so. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, the tapping came again, but now there was something new, whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs coming from the walls. It felt like something was trying to speak, trying to get my attention. The whispering grew louder, like a chant, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my things and left the house in the middle of the night. I drove into town and stayed at a motel, trying to shake off the cold, the dread. The next morning, I called Simon again. His response was unsettling. "You left? I thought I told you. The house is like that. You weren't supposed to stay overnight." He sounded almost angry. "You shouldn't have stayed. You never should have stayed. I don't know what happened in that house, but I'll never go back." Whatever history Simon was referring to, I'm not sure I want to know. But I do know one thing. Some places don't want you to leave. I'm 29 years old and work as a freelance graphic designer. The flexibility of my job allows me to work from anywhere, which I usually take advantage of by seeking quiet, isolated places to focus and get creative. Recently, I found an Airbnb listing in a remote area of Northern California, a small, rustic cabin tucked in the woods. It seemed perfect for a weekend away from the hustle of city life. No neighbors for miles, no distractions, just me, my laptop, and nature. I didn't think twice about it. The reviews were good, the price was right, and I'd been feeling burned out from work. I was looking for some peace. The cabin was everything I hoped for and more. It was small, cozy, and decorated in a way that felt both old-fashioned and comfortable. The windows offered a view of thick, green trees, and the only sound at night was the rustling of leaves in the wind. It seemed like the perfect place to disconnect. However, as soon as I arrived, I felt strange. The atmosphere felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were watching. But I chalked it up to being in a new environment and tried to settle in. The first day went smoothly. I worked, made some tea, took a walk around the cabin, and watched the sunset over the trees. The night was quiet, serene, almost peaceful. But things changed that second night. It started with a faint tapping sound on the windows. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But when I went to check, there was nothing. No branches swaying, no animals nearby. I locked the windows and went back to work, trying to push away the creeping sense of unease. Later that night, around midnight, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, as though someone or something was trying to get my attention. I stood up, heart racing, and glanced outside. The moonlight reflected off the trees, but there was nothing. No movement. Nothing at all. I tried to ignore it and went back to bed. But the noise didn't stop. Tup, tup, tup. The rhythmic sound was now coming from all around the cabin. It wasn't just the windows, it seemed to echo from the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards. I couldn't make sense of it. I wanted to call someone, but my phone had no signal out here. I was alone, isolated, with nothing but the sound of tapping and the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I heard the whisper. It was soft, distant, but unmistakable. A voice. Almost inaudible. It seemed to be coming from the forest just beyond the cabin. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unnerving. It wasn't a natural sound. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door to step outside, shining the light around the perimeter of the cabin. There was nothing there. No one. Only the dense trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The whispering stopped the moment I stepped outside, and the air felt still again, almost too still. When I went back inside, I locked the door and drew the blinds. The tapping was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake it. It felt like someone, or something, was out there waiting, watching. I tried to sleep, but every small noise made my heart race. I kept hearing soft footsteps outside the cabin, like someone was pacing back and forth. I told myself it was just the wind again, but a part of me knew better. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise that wasn't like the others. It was louder, more forceful, like something, or someone, was banging on the door. Bang, bang, bang. My heart nearly stopped. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight again, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the empty forest. I checked all the windows, double-checked the locks. Everything was in place. But I knew something wasn't right. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, trying not to look outside at the trees. Every time I looked out a window, I half expected to see a face staring back at me. The moment I was ready to leave, I noticed something that chilled me to my core. As I walked towards the door, I saw something on the window. The condensation had formed into clear, distinct handprints, as if someone had been standing there looking in. I rushed out of the cabin, not bothering to lock the door behind me, and got in my car. The drive back was a blur, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. Just empty road stretching behind me. I still don't know who or what was out there in those woods. I don't know what was making those noises or who was watching me from the window, but I can't forget the handprints and the feeling that I was never alone, not for a second. I'm 32, a freelance writer, and my work often requires me to spend time in quiet, isolated places to focus. A few weeks ago, a friend offered me the chance to stay at their old house while they were out of town. It wasn't a house I had ever been to before, and I figured it would be a good opportunity to get some work done. The house was in a rural area, about an hour outside the city, surrounded by dense forest. The place had always given off a certain sense of mystery, and my friend had mentioned in passing that the house was quite old, dating back over a century. But I wasn't particularly worried about it. I arrived in the early afternoon, and the place was just as I had imagined. An old, creaky farmhouse with faded paint and overgrown vines creeping up the walls. The air smelled musty, and the floorboards groaned with every step I took, but it was charming in its own way. The house was far from modern, and most of the rooms were sparsely furnished. But it had a certain nostalgic feeling, like a forgotten relic of the past. The first evening went by without incident. I settled into one of the upstairs bedrooms and set up my writing desk by the window. I spent a few hours working, occasionally glancing out at the darkening sky. The house was quiet, too quiet, but it didn't bother me. I was used to silence. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were distinct, slow, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking around downstairs. At first, I thought it might be the house settling, or perhaps the wind causing some movement. But the sound was consistent, rhythmic, and it didn't stop. I was about to get up and check, but then the footsteps moved closer, coming up the stairs. My heart started racing. I could hear them slowly approaching the door of the room where I was. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, but I didn't hear anyone knocking or trying to enter. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated back down the stairs, leaving me alone once more. I didn't get up that night. I just lay there wide awake, staring at the door. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just my imagination? Had the wind caused some strange creaks in the house? Or was someone actually in the house? The next day, I decided to explore the house during daylight. Maybe there was an explanation for the strange sounds. As I walked through the rooms, I noticed old photographs of a family I didn't recognize, and in the attic, there were stacks of old furniture and boxes covered in dust. It all seemed to tell the story of a family that had long since left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table trying to focus on my writing, but my mind kept drifting back to the footsteps. I tried to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach, but the house seemed to be getting colder. Even though it was summer, I could feel a chill in the air. The wind had died down and the house was unusually still. No creaking floorboards, no sounds from outside, just the oppressive silence. Then as I sat there, I heard the footsteps again. They were soft at first, but they quickly grew louder, more deliberate. I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't sit there anymore. I stood up and walked slowly to the hallway, trying to quiet my breathing. The footsteps were unmistakable now. They were right outside the kitchen door. I peered around the corner, but there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, and the attic, but I found nothing. There was no one else in the house. The footsteps, whatever they were, had no clear origin. I checked the windows, but they were locked and no one had entered. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Could it have been the house itself? Some old creak in the structure causing the sounds? But the sounds felt too real, too intentional to be just the house. I decided to leave. I packed my things, grabbed my bags, and walked out the door. As I stepped outside, I realized I hadn't heard the footsteps since I'd checked the kitchen. There was a strange calm now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though I had checked every corner of the house, it felt as though something, or someone, was still there watching me from inside. I didn't return to the house. I told my friend about the strange noises and how I felt unnerved, but they just laughed it off. They told me it was probably just the house settling. But I never went back to that place. Something about it still lingers in my memory, and the thought of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, still sends a shiver down my spine. I don't know who or what was in that house, but it's a feeling I haven't been able to shake. It's as if there was someone, or something, there that didn't want me there. The silence, the cold air, and those footsteps, I'll never forget them. And I'll never go back. I'm a 35-year-old graphic designer, living a fairly ordinary life. Most of the time, I spend my days working from home or running errands. I don't usually go on vacations, but when my friend Claire invited me to her family cabin for the weekend, I figured it would be a nice change of pace. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet, to unwind and get away from the city for a bit. We arrived on Friday evening, after a long drive through winding, narrow roads. The sky was already dark by the time we reached the cabin, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. The place looked like something straight out of a postcard, an old, rustic cabin made of wood with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. There was no electricity, just a few solar-powered lights outside and a generator for the essentials inside. As we unpacked our bags, Claire mentioned that the cabin had been in her family for generations. Her parents had used it as a getaway when they were younger, and now it was just sitting there, mostly unused. She assured me that there was nothing to worry about. It was just a quiet, secluded place to relax. That night, we made a simple dinner and sat outside by the fire pit. The forest around us was dense and dark, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, though there was something unsettling about the stillness. I chalked it up to the isolation and the unfamiliar surroundings. As the night went on, we sat in silence, drinking and talking. Claire mentioned that she had heard some strange things about the cabin when she was younger. Whispers about people going missing in the woods nearby, old stories about strange happenings, but she didn't seem too bothered by it. She said it was just local superstition, nothing to take seriously. I didn't think much of it. That is, until the following night. It was around midnight when I woke up, feeling an odd sense of unease. The cabin was silent, except for the faint sounds of wind outside. I reached for my phone to check the time and noticed something strange. There was a faint light coming from the forest, far in the distance. I thought it might have been a car, but it wasn't moving and the light was too steady. I tried to ignore it, but the more I stared at the light, the more it seemed to grow brighter. It wasn't a typical car light, it had an almost unnatural glow to it. After a few minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to investigate. I quietly slipped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, making sure I didn't wake Claire. The light from the forest was still there, now pulsing with an eerie rhythm like some kind of signal. I stepped out onto the porch, my breath visible in the cold night air. As I made my way toward the edge of the woods, the light seemed to flicker, then vanish entirely. I paused, trying to understand what I had just seen. But as I turned to head back toward the cabin, I noticed something else. There was a figure standing in the trees, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It was tall and thin, with an unnatural stillness. My heart started pounding. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing for an explanation. Was it someone playing a prank? But who would be out here at this hour in the middle of nowhere? The figure remained motionless, watching me. Suddenly, the light from the forest flickered back on, but it was much closer now, much brighter, almost blinding. I stumbled back toward the cabin, but as I did, the figure began to move. It glided silently through the trees, almost as if it wasn't walking at all, but floating. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what I had just seen. Claire woke up as I tried to calm my breath, asking if I was okay. I couldn't find the words. She seemed puzzled but didn't press further, assuming I had just had a bad dream or something. The rest of the night passed in an eerie silence. I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the figure watching me, its presence lingering in the dark. The next morning, I decided to leave. Claire was confused but agreed to pack up early and head back to the city. She didn't seem to understand the urgency in my tone, but she packed her things without asking too many questions. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The forest seemed still, almost too still, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I never told Claire the full extent of what I saw. She never mentioned anything strange happening while we were there, and I didn't want to scare her. But I've never been back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in the woods that night. The figure, the light, the strange feeling of being watched. There's something about that place that still unsettles me even now. Some nights, I still wonder if the cabin was truly empty, or if something else had been waiting there just beyond the trees. I'd been living in the same apartment building for almost a year now, and everything had been fairly uneventful. The building itself was old, creaky floors, narrow hallways, and peeling wallpaper, but it had character. I didn't mind the quirks. It was cheap, relatively quiet, and close to the grocery store. There were only a few other tenants in the building, most of whom I rarely saw. That's how I liked it. But then, a few weeks ago, a new neighbor moved in across the hall. At first, I didn't think much of it. People moved in and out all the time. But I noticed something odd about this new neighbor. He was completely silent. I don't mean quiet. I mean there was no sound at all coming from his apartment. For days, I didn't hear a single door open or close, no footsteps, no music, nothing. I tried not to let it bother me, but it felt wrong. You know how you can sometimes feel someone's presence without even seeing them? That was the feeling I got every time I passed his door in the hallway. A constant, heavy silence that seemed to press against me like he was always there, watching. One night, around midnight, I had to run to my car to grab something I'd forgotten. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. His door was ajar, just slightly, barely enough to catch the edge of the light from inside the apartment spilling out. But it wasn't the light that caught my attention. It was the sound, or rather, the lack of sound. The silence was oppressive, like the air around his apartment had thickened. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to knock or just ignore it. But I felt a strange compulsion to peek inside. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open just a little further, enough to see into the room. It was an ordinary apartment. Dark furniture, an old rug, and what appeared to be a desk with some papers scattered on it. Nothing out of the ordinary. But there, standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, was a man. His back was to the door, but his posture was stiff, unnaturally stiff. He didn't move a muscle, didn't even seem to breathe. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight outside. And yet, despite the darkness, I could see him clearly, almost too clearly. It felt like he was glowing, like the light was coming from within him, though I couldn't explain why. My heart raced and I quickly stepped back, closing the door quietly. I didn't know what I had just seen, but something in my gut told me I wasn't supposed to be looking. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe he was just standing still for a long time, lost in thought. I shook my head and walked back to my apartment, trying to push the feeling away. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of the man standing in the dark. Every time I passed his door, I felt the same heavy presence pressing against me. I tried to avoid looking at his apartment, but it was always there, in the corner of my vision. His silence, his stillness, it was suffocating. Then it happened again. One night after I returned from work, I heard a noise from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the sound of someone moving furniture, but when I opened the door to check, there was nothing. The hallway was completely empty, just like always. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the hall, the door to his apartment was wide open and I could see into the room. The man was standing there again, perfectly still, facing me this time. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't blinking. He didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. His mouth was slightly open, as though he was about to speak, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. There was something wrong about him, about the way he stood there, staring into nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally managed to break free from the trance, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those unblinking eyes, staring at me from the hallway. I could still hear the silence, thick and unyielding, pressing against my walls. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do. I called the landlord. I told him about the strange happenings in the building, but he just laughed it off. "It's an old building," he said. "Things creak and groan all the time. Maybe you're just hearing things." But I knew it wasn't that. I knew something was wrong. When I checked the building's tenant list later, I was shocked to see that the apartment across the hall had been listed as vacant for months. There was no record of a new tenant. There was no one living there. That night, I waited, my eyes glued to the hallway. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something truly was wrong. And as I watched, the door across the hall opened again, and the man stepped into the hallway, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but the silence was deafening. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hand and pointed directly at me. I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, like it was crushing me. I backed away from the door, slowly at first, then faster as I realized that no matter how far I went, he would always be there, staring at me from the other side. I moved out of the building the next morning, and I've never looked back. I had agreed to watch my aunt's house for a week while she was away on a vacation. She lived on the outskirts of a small town, in a quiet, somewhat isolated neighborhood. The house was old, a century-old farmhouse with creaky floors and an attic that always seemed colder than the rest of the house. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to be alone in, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to being alone. I'd been living alone in an apartment for a few years and I worked from home, so the solitude didn't bother me. Besides, I figured I could get some writing done and enjoy a few quiet days away from the city. The first few days were fine. The only strange thing I noticed was the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It would occasionally chime at odd hours, though it had been broken for years. But I chalked that up to my imagination, the quiet of the house making everything sound more pronounced. On the fourth day I woke up to a noise, scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind, the old house settling under the pressure of a storm that had rolled in during the night. But then it came again, louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone, was scratching at the walls. I froze, lying still in bed, listening. The sound seemed to move, coming from one side of the house and then the other, as if someone was walking through the walls. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house making its usual noises. But as the day wore on, the scratching continued, growing more frequent. By evening, I had convinced myself that I needed to check it out. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, then started upstairs to the attic. As I stood at the foot of the staircase, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A piece of paper on the bottom step, crumpled and worn. It didn't seem to belong. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking slightly. The note was in a child's handwriting, scribbled in red ink. It said, "Don't go up. He's waiting." My heart pounded. Who had left this? And why in my aunt's house? I immediately called my aunt, but there was no answer. She had told me she'd be unreachable for the day, so I was left with nothing but the unsettling message and a creeping sense of dread. I decided not to go upstairs. But the scratching didn't stop. In fact, it grew worse. I tried to distract myself by reading or watching TV, but the noise kept growing louder, always seeming to come from above, just above my head. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a broom and cautiously ascended the stairs to the attic, trying to ignore the increasingly cold air that seemed to follow me up. As I reached the top, I hesitated, but the door to the attic creaked open by itself, revealing the dimly lit space beyond. I shone my flashlight into the room, and that's when I saw it. The walls weren't just scratched. They were gouged, deep and jagged, as though something had tried to claw its way out. But what really froze me in place was the corner of the room. There, in the shadows, was a figure. It was a man, hunched over, his face obscured by the darkness. But I could see his hands. They were long, with unnaturally sharp nails, and they were scraping against the floor, leaving long, deep grooves in the wood. I couldn't move. My breath hitched, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought it might explode. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The man shifted, his head turning towards me, but his eyes, they were completely black. No pupils, just endless void staring back at me. He didn't move at first, but then, slowly he started to rise. I could hear his bones crack and pop as he stood, his form growing taller and taller until he loomed over me. I backed away, tripping over a stack of old boxes, but I didn't care. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't even stop to grab my things. I bolted out the front door and ran down the long driveway, not stopping until I was on the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. They took me to the nearest gas station, and I called a cab to take me to the town center. The next morning, I returned to the house with the police. The attic was empty. No sign of the scratches, the message, or the figure. Just a dusty and used space. I showed them the note, but they seemed skeptical. They found nothing unusual, no signs of a break-in or anything that could explain what I had experienced. When I went to collect my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet now, too still. As I was about to leave, I noticed something in the corner of the hallway. The grandfather clock, which had been silent since I arrived, had started to tick again. But the time was wrong, way off, stuck at 3:17. I left without saying another word. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know who or what was in the attic or why it was waiting. But I never went back, and I haven't heard from my aunt since. The only thing I know for sure is that whatever I saw in that house was real, and it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I was in my late 20s when I was assigned a last-minute project in a small town about 2 hours away. The company booked a hotel for me, and I was expected to stay for a week to finalize everything. The moment I arrived, I realized the place had an odd, unsettling atmosphere. The hotel was an old, historic building, located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick trees and barely any light at night. The first night I noticed the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of a remote place, but a strange, almost unnatural stillness. No crickets, no distant traffic, just the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. I figured it was just the location and I dismissed it. But the second night was different. I woke up to a cold draft, my window slightly ajar despite having closed it before sleeping. I could hear something faint, footsteps outside my room, slow and deliberate. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just another guest. But the footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited, breath held, expecting them to pass, but they didn't. It was as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. I stared at the door, too afraid to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The next day, I brushed it off as a bad dream. I had work to do after all. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, I heard them clearly. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking around my room, pacing slowly. I got up, grabbed my phone, and checked the hallway through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued. They were too close, too deliberate for it to be a coincidence. I quickly locked the door and called the front desk, but the receptionist assured me that no one was on the floor except for me. She even said I could check the security footage, but when I arrived at the lobby, the monitors were all mysteriously down. I was getting increasingly uneasy, but I tried to stay calm. There was a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind again or the old building making strange sounds. On the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. And then there it was again, the footsteps. But this time they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside my room. I turned my head slowly toward the corner of the room where the sound was coming from. There, in the shadows, was a figure standing completely still. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if it was real. The figure remained motionless, as if it was waiting for something. The silence was suffocating. I didn't dare to blink or breathe too loudly. And then the figure stepped forward. It was slow, deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Every inch it moved closer felt like an eternity. It didn't make a sound. No footsteps. Just the oppressive quiet that seemed to close in around me. Just when it was only a few feet from my bed, I snapped out of my paralysis. I bolted out of bed, turned on the lights, and screamed at the empty room, but the figure was gone. My breath came in sharp gasps as I looked frantically around the room. The only sound was the ticking of the clock, which seemed unnaturally loud now. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't sleep. I packed my things in a daze, trying to shake the image of that figure from my mind. The next morning, I left the hotel as early as possible, not bothering to check out properly. I just wanted to get out. I called a cab and left without a word to anyone, still haunted by the feeling that I wasn't alone. Years later, I learned that the hotel had been built on the site of a former asylum. There had been rumors about a patient who died under mysterious circumstances and was said to wander the halls at night. I couldn't help but wonder if what I saw that night was him, or something worse. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that hotel. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone, I hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and I freeze, waiting for the silence to return. But it never does. I was in my early 30s when I took a trip with my wife to a small, remote town in the countryside. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway from our hectic lives, a break from the noise and chaos of city living. We rented a charming little cottage on the edge of town, a house that had been around for decades, according to the landlord. The house itself was lovely at first glance, rustic, with large windows that looked out onto a small forest and a field behind the property. The owner had warned us that the house had been sitting empty for a while, But there was nothing unusual about it, she assured us. It was simply old. On the first night, everything was quiet. We spent the evening cooking, drinking wine, and relaxing by the fire. As we went to bed, I noticed something strange. The house, despite its age, seemed too still, too silent. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no wind rattling the windows. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I dismissed it as my imagination and fell asleep quickly. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside our bedroom door. It wasn't the normal creak of old wood, but the distinct sound of someone walking, slow and deliberate. I sat up, straining my ears, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. But then the footsteps stopped right outside our door, and there was a brief moment of silence. I waited, my heart racing. Then, I heard the sound of a soft knock, like someone tapping on the door with their knuckles. My wife was still asleep, unaware of the noise, and I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I eventually got up, walked cautiously to the door, and opened it. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there, just the shadows of old furniture lining the walls. I was about to close the door when I noticed something odd. The hallway light was flickering. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a malfunction, but something didn't sit right. I checked the rest of the house. Everything was locked, secure, and undisturbed. The footsteps never returned that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to my wife, but she just laughed it off as me being paranoid. After all, old houses creaked and groaned all the time. That day, we decided to explore the surrounding area, and we ended up at the local general store. While there, I mentioned to the shopkeeper that we were staying at the old house on the outskirts of town. His expression immediately changed. His friendly demeanor faded, and he gave me a long, hard look before asking if I was sure we were staying there. When I confirmed, he said, "That house has been abandoned for years. No one stays there anymore. Is not right?" I laughed nervously, assuming he was just pulling my leg, but he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. He told me that the house had a history, but he wouldn't say more. Just that some things were best left alone. That night, I decided to stay up a little longer than usual. I was determined to catch whatever was causing the noises. Around midnight, the footsteps began again, soft, methodical, getting closer to the bedroom. But this time, I wasn't going to just listen. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I had kept on the nightstand. I crept to the door, heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, I froze. The hallway was empty again, but this time the air was thick with an unsettling chill. The light flickered violently above me, and the silence felt suffocating. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure standing motionless, facing away from me. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, too terrified to move, too frightened to call out. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't move. After what felt like hours, it turned slowly and started to walk toward me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. It was a shadow of a person, like something not quite human. I slammed the door shut, but the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They continued outside the door, circling the room, growing louder. I could feel the weight of whatever it was pressing against the door as if trying to get in. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my wife and forced her to leave with me. We rushed out of the house and into the car, driving through the night, not looking back. When we returned the next day to collect our belongings, the house was completely empty. No sign of our things, no evidence that we had ever been there. The landlord had no idea what I was talking about and insisted the house had always been vacant. There was no trace of the footsteps, the figure, or the chill in the air. We never spoke of it again, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was waiting in that house. Something that still lingers, waiting for the next person to wander too close. I've always liked hiking and camping, so when my friends invited me to join them on a weekend hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains, I was excited. The plan was to trek for 3 days, camping out at various stops along the way. Our final stop was a remote old bunkhouse that looked like something straight out of a horror movie. It was built by a local guide, abandoned for years and used by hikers only occasionally. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the area. The house was secluded, surrounded by tall pines and tucked away from the main trail. I didn't think much of it at the time, thinking it would be a nice place to rest before completing the last stretch of the hike. The inside was musty, the wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the windows were sealed shut with old curtains. But it was dry, sheltered, and safe from the unpredictable mountain weather. My friends and I joked and laughed as we set up our sleeping bags and started a small fire inside the old stone fireplace. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. That night, after we had all turned in, I couldn't sleep. The silence was overwhelming, too still, too complete. I could hear the faint crackle of the fire, but it didn't mask the unsettling noises that began to creep into the room. First, it was the soft thudding sound like something, or someone, was pacing outside the bunkhouse. Then came a scraping noise, like a hand dragging along the rough walls of the cabin. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just the wind. I tried to fall back asleep, but a sense of dread had settled over me. It was like the walls were closing in. I kept hearing the footsteps, closer now, like someone was circling the building looking for a way in. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low, hoarse, and unintelligible, whispered from somewhere near the door. I jumped out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing. I looked at my friends, all of them sound asleep, unaware of the tension that gripped me. My eyes darted to the small window by the door. The shadows outside had grown deeper, and I could swear I saw something move just beyond the glass. It looked like a figure, tall and hunched over, like it was peering in at us. I rushed to the window, pushing aside the curtain. My heart nearly stopped when I saw nothing but the dark outline of the trees. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of exhaustion and fear, and I tried to relax. But then I heard it again, the faint scraping. And this time it was coming from inside the bunkhouse. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The room was empty, but as my light swept across the walls, it illuminated something strange. A series of scratch marks, deep and fresh, on the wooden beams above us. They looked almost deliberate, as if something had clawed its way across the room. My mind raced as panic set in. There was no way that could have happened on its own. Someone, or something, was here with us. I quietly woke my friends and told them we had to leave. But when we tried to pack up, the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck, jammed from the outside. We were trapped. We tried the windows, but they were all sealed shut, and none of us wanted to risk breaking them in case we had to make a quick escape. We sat there in complete silence as the sound of footsteps continued outside, growing louder and more frantic. At one point, we heard something banging against the walls like it was trying to break through. But when we looked outside again, nothing was there. It wasn't until dawn, when the first light of morning pierced through the cracks in the walls, that the door finally opened. We didn't wait to look back. We grabbed our things and bolted down the trail as fast as we could, not daring to stop until we reached the main trail. When we finally made it back to the parking lot, I looked back at the mountain, at the spot where the bunkhouse should have been. But there was nothing. No cabin, no sign of the place we had just spent the night in. It was as if it had never existed. We went to the local ranger station later to report what happened, but the ranger just looked at us with a strange expression. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. "The old cabin. It's been abandoned for years. People who go up there, they don't come back. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that bunkhouse. I've tried to forget about it, but every time I'm alone in the woods, I hear those same footsteps, just beyond my hearing, always pacing, always waiting." I'm a 32-year-old software developer. A couple of years ago, I took a trip up to the Pacific Northwest for some much-needed time away from work. My plan was simple: rent a cabin in the mountains, take long hikes, and clear my head. It was a beautiful place, remote and quiet, nestled deep in the forest. I was alone, but I didn't mind. The solitude was exactly what I needed. The weather was perfect, and I spent the first few days hiking, reading, and just enjoying nature. On the fourth day, I decided to hike a new trail I hadn't explored yet, one that was supposed to be a shortcut to a nearby lake. The map showed it as a thin red line cutting across the wilderness, but it didn't look like it would be too difficult. I figured I'd be back before dark. I followed the path, and as expected, it was a lot quieter than the main trail. The trees were dense, and there was a strange stillness in the air. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, which wasn't surprising given the area's remoteness. After about an hour of walking, I came across an old wooden signpost with faded letters. It was hard to make out, but it seemed to warn about dangerous areas and unstable ground. I thought nothing of it and continued. The path narrowed as I went deeper into the woods, and before long, I realized I hadn't seen the usual trail markers for a while. I checked my phone to find the GPS signal was weak, barely enough to get a reading. I didn't think much of it, telling myself it was just a little out of the way. But as the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. Something felt off. The air was heavy, and the sounds of wildlife had stopped completely. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard something. The sound of footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one. I stood still, trying to listen, but the sound stopped. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe I was just being paranoid. I decided to keep moving, though I felt more and more on edge. Then, as I rounded a bend in the path, I came face to face with a man standing in the middle of the trail. He was tall, wearing dark clothes and a hood, and his face was mostly obscured by shadows. He didn't say a word, just stood there, unmoving, staring at me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to do. He didn't look like someone who belonged in the area. There was something off about him, his stillness, the way he seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I took a few steps back, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. But when I checked, the signal was gone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the cabin. The man didn't move. I hesitated, then decided to walk around him. As I took a few cautious steps to the side, I noticed a small trail of footprints in the dirt, leading away from where the man was standing. They weren't his, too small, too erratic, as if someone had been running. I tried to stay calm and walk away, but then he moved. Not toward me, but toward the side of the trail where the trees thickened. He disappeared into the woods without a sound, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't waste any time. My instincts told me to get out of there, fast. I turned and started to jog back the way I came, but as I did, I heard it again. Footsteps coming from behind me. Only this time they were faster, heavier, and closer. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was there again, his pace quickening. I could hear the sound of his boots hitting the ground, the crunch of branches as he ran after me. Panic set in, and I broke into a full sprint. The path twisted and turned, but it felt like it was never ending. I kept looking back, expecting to see him gaining on me, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The deeper I ran into the woods, the more disoriented I became. Every tree, every bend in the path seemed to blur together. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw a clearing up ahead. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, until I broke through the trees and saw the road leading to the cabin. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't hear any more footsteps or see anyone, but the tension in the air was palpable. I stayed inside, checking the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see that man watching from the trees. The next morning, I went back to the trail, determined to find out what had happened. The road I had taken was still there, but there was no sign of the man, no footprints. The path itself seemed normal again, just a quiet stretch of forest. But I never went back to that shortcut. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I left the cabin early, cutting my trip short. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Was the man just another hiker? Did he follow me? Or was it something else entirely? All I know is that some shortcuts lead to places you never expect, and some people you meet you just don't forget. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.